Hello there and welcome back. Tonight we are leaving behind the noise and speed of the modern world and stepping into the dangerous glitter of Tudor England, into a world of candlelit palaces, velvet sleeves, political whispers, musicians playing deep into the evening, and a king whose desires would permanently change the history of England. And somewhere ahead of us, behind the feasts and gold and royal spectacle, lies one of the most feared courts in Europe, a court where a smile from the king could transform a life forever, and where losing his favour could destroy it just as quickly. So before we begin tonight, take a moment to let yourself settle. Let the day, with its small accumulations of effort and attention, set itself down somewhere outside the room you are in. Let your shoulders drop, let your jaw soften, let your hands rest, palm up or palm down, whichever feels easier. Let your breath find the slower rhythm that the evening allows. There is nothing you need to hold on to for the next while. The world will continue its business without your supervision. Tonight is for the slower kind of attention that a long story requires, and we will give it that attention together. Tonight I want to tell you about Henry VIII. I want to tell you about him, however, in a particular way, not the version of him that the popular imagination has produced, the fat, jolly, red-faced king with the leg of mutton in one hand and the wife to be executed in the other. Not the version that the films and television series have constructed with their elegant costumes and their dramatic music and their convenient simplifications. The actual man, the actual king, as the historical record preserves him, the boy who became, in his teens, the most promising Renaissance prince in Europe, beloved by his subjects and admired by his foreign rivals, the young man who reigned, for the first half of his career, in a way that the contemporary observers genuinely thought might produce one of the great reigns of English history. The middle-aged king who slowly, by stages that we can now trace with considerable precision, became the figure that the popular memory has retained. The old man who died in 1547 in a body that had been ruined by years of accumulated injury and illness, and who left behind a country that he had transformed, for better and for worse, in ways that would shape the rest of English history. The Henry VIII that everyone thinks they know is, in many respects, a kind of compressed cartoon, the figure who has been reduced, by the operations of popular memory, to a few visible features and a list of 6 wives. The actual man was considerably more complex, more interesting, and in some respects considerably stranger than the cartoon suggests. He was a competent musician who composed pieces that are still performed. He was a serious theologian who wrote, in his own hand, a book defending the Catholic faith against Martin Luther, for which the Pope gave him the title Defender of the Faith, a title that the English monarchs still hold today, 6 wives and a reformation later, by the small accidents of historical inheritance. He was an accomplished athlete who played tennis at a level that contemporary observers thought genuinely impressive, who jousted in the great tournaments of his court, who hunted on horseback for entire days at a stretch. He spoke fluent French and Latin and competent Spanish and Italian. He read widely. He patronized the arts at a level that few English monarchs before or since have matched. He brought Hans Holbein to England, where the painter produced the portraits that have, more than any other source, shaped our visual sense of the era. He was also, in the second half of his reign, a deeply paranoid man whose growing fears reshaped the politics of his kingdom in ways that produced, among other consequences, the deaths of a number of his closest friends and advisers and several of his wives. The Henry of the second half is one of the most studied and most psychologically complex figures of the entire Tudor era. and the question of how the brilliant young prince of 1509 became the sick, paranoid old king of 1546 is one of the enduring puzzles of English history. Tonight I want to walk through that whole arc with you, from the boy in the schoolroom to the old man in the bed, from the coronation in 1509 to the death in 1547. From the early years of confidence and accomplishment to the late years of fear and decline. I want to give you the man as the historical record preserves him, with the contradictions and complexities that the popular cartoon has flattened out. And I want to leave you, by the end of the evening, with a sense of the actual person who lived inside the famous role, rather than the simplified figure that has stood in for him in the popular imagination for the past several centuries. So get comfortable, pull a blanket up if you need it. Let your eyes close if they want to, although you can keep them open if you would rather. We are going to spend the evening with one of the most consequential and most complicated figures of English history, in the slow, patient kind of company that a long evening allows. And by the end, I think you will know him in a way that the dramatic versions of him have not quite given you. Let me begin where the story actually begins. Not on the throne, not at the wedding altar. In a small room in a Tudor palace in 1491, where a baby was being born who was not, at the time of his birth, expected to become King of England. Henry was the second son of Henry VII, the first Tudor king, who had taken the English throne in 1485 by his victory over Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. Henry VII had married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, and the marriage had united the warring branches of the royal family that had fought, for the earlier decades, in the long civil conflict that history has come to call the Wars of the Roses. The first child of the marriage was Arthur, who had been born in 1486, and who was, by the conventions of primogeniture, the heir to the throne. The second surviving child was Margaret, born in 1489, who would in due course be married off to King James IV of Scotland, in the dynastic arrangement that, several generations later, would produce the Stuart kings of England. The third surviving child was Henry, born in June of 1491 at the Palace of Placentia at Greenwich in the conditions of careful royal birth that the conventions of the era required. Henry, as the second son, was destined for the church. This was the standard arrangement for the second sons of the higher nobility in late medieval England. The eldest son inherited the title and the lands. The second son was given an education that prepared him for a senior career in the church, which would, by the conventions of the era, give him a respectable income and a position of social standing without requiring any provision from the family estate. The Tudor royal family, which was new on the throne, and which was actively constructing the conventions of its own dynastic continuity, followed the standard practice. Arthur was prepared for kingship. Henry was prepared for the church. This early plan for Henry's life is one of the least well-known features of his biography, and it is worth pausing on, because the education that he received in his first decade and a half was the education of a future churchman rather than a future king, and it shaped the man he became in ways that the conventional accounts of his life tend to overlook. The young Henry was given, from the age of perhaps 4 or 5, the sort of intensive academic training that a future bishop would need. He was taught Latin and Greek and the rudiments of Hebrew. He was given a thorough grounding in scripture, in theology, and in the controversies of late medieval church doctrine. He was taught music, which was understood by the era to be one of the central accomplishments of an educated cleric. He was taught the small disciplines of devotion that the religious life required. He was, by his early teens, the sort of intensively educated young man that the church of the era considered an excellent candidate for senior promotion. He was also, by all accounts, a young man of considerable natural ability, who absorbed the academic material his tutors gave him at a pace that surprised the men who taught him, and who reported back to his father on his progress. The plan, however, did not survive the spring of 1502. In April of that year, Arthur, who had been married the previous November to Catherine of Aragon, the youngest daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, fell ill at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh marches, where he had been sent to begin the apprenticeship in royal administration that the heir to the throne was expected to undertake. The illness, which contemporary accounts described in terms that modern historians have been unable to identify with certainty, but which may have been some form of viral pneumonia or influenza, progressed rapidly. Within 10 days of falling ill, Arthur was dead. He was 15 years old. The death of Arthur changed everything. The 11-year-old Henry, who had been preparing for a career in the church, was now suddenly the heir to the throne. The whole apparatus of his education had to be redirected. The Latin and Greek and the theology continued, but to them was added the substantial additional curriculum of a future king, the law and the politics and the military arts that the prince expected to inherit the throne would need. The change was substantial, and it was conducted at speed, because Henry VII, who had been ill himself in the previous year, and who could not be certain how much time remained to prepare his second son for kingship, was operating under the sort of pressure that the unexpected death of an heir produces. Catherine of Aragon, in the meantime, was a 16-year-old widow at the English court, with no clear prospects and no easy route home. Her parents, Ferdinand and Isabella, had paid a substantial dowry for her marriage to Arthur, and they were not inclined to walk away from the investment. Henry VII, who had received the first half of the dowry but who was still owed the second, was equally unwilling to release her. The diplomatic arrangement that emerged after considerable negotiation between the two courts was that Catherine would remain in England and would, in due course, marry Henry, the new heir to the throne, when he was old enough. The plan required a papal dispensation, because the canon law of the era prohibited a man from marrying his deceased brother's wife, and the dispensation was eventually granted by Pope Julius II on the grounds that the first marriage had not been consummated and was therefore not, in the strict sense, a complete marriage. The dispensation, which I want you to remember because it will come back into our story in a critical way nearly 30 years later, allowed the engagement to proceed. Henry VII died in April 1509 of the tuberculosis that had been slowly killing him for several years. Henry VIII, who was 17, came to the throne. The new king, 6 weeks after his accession, married Catherine of Aragon in a private ceremony at the chapel of the Franciscan friars at Greenwich. He was 18 days short of his 18th birthday. Catherine was 23. Having spent the 7 years since Arthur's death waiting for the marriage that had now finally come. The coronation of the new king and the new queen, performed jointly at Westminster Abbey, was the great public ceremony of the summer of 1509, and the young Henry, in his coronation regalia, at the head of the procession through London, presented to his subjects an image of royal magnificence that the country had not quite seen before. I want to spend a little time on the young Henry, because the popular image of him is so heavily shaped by the older Henry that the original man tends to get lost. The young Henry of 1509 was, by every contemporary account, an exceptional figure. He was tall, somewhat over 6 feet, which was tall by the standards of the era. He was strongly built, with the broad shoulders and the powerful legs of a serious athlete. His hair was reddish gold, kept short in the fashion of the time. His face was, by the testimony of the ambassadors who reported on him to their courts, genuinely handsome, with regular features and the sort of clear skin that the era considered a particular mark of good looks in a young man. He was, in his bearing and his manner, the most physically impressive of all the European monarchs of his generation, and the foreign ambassadors who saw him in his early years agreed with an unanimity that is unusual in their reports that he was a young man whose presence was striking. He was also, by all accounts, charming. He had, in his interactions with his subjects and with foreign visitors, the sort of easy warmth that the era expected of a great prince, and that very few great princes actually possessed. He laughed readily. He spoke easily and well. He listened with attention to the men who came to him on business, and he gave in his replies the sort of considered responses that suggested he had genuinely understood what he had been told. He was in this respect almost the opposite of his father, who had been a careful, taciturn man, whose long survival on a contested throne had taught him to give as little of himself as possible to anyone, including his own family. The young Henry, by contrast, gave generously of his attention and his presence, and the people around him responded to this generosity with the sort of personal devotion that the older Henry VII had never inspired and never sought. He was an accomplished musician. He played the lute and the virginals and the recorder. He sang, by the testimony of those who heard him, with a fine, clear voice. He composed in the years of his youth a number of pieces that have survived in the manuscript collections of the era. The most famous of these, the song called Pastime with Good Company, remains a standard piece of Tudor music and is still performed today. The composition, which was probably written when Henry was in his late teens or early 20s, is a substantial musical achievement in its own right, and it tells us something about the breadth of the young king's accomplishments that he could produce, as a side activity to his other pursuits, work that has held its place in the musical canon for 500 years. The musical establishment of the court that Henry built up around his own personal interest in music was, by the standards of the era, one of the most substantial in Europe. The Chapel Royal, which was the body of professional musicians attached to the King's Chapel, employed perhaps 30 singers and instrumentalists, including some of the leading composers and performers of the era. The king imported musicians from Italy and France and the Netherlands to supplement the English musicians of the establishment, and the cumulative effect of his patronage was the development, in the early 16th century, of one of the great periods of English court music. The manuscript collections that have survived from the period, including the so-called Henry VIII manuscript, that is now held at the British Library, preserve the musical repertoire of the court and give us a picture of the daily musical life of the establishment that is unusually detailed for the era. The king himself, throughout his life, and even into the difficult years of his late decline, continued to take a personal interest in the music of his court, and the reports of his last years include the small detail that he was still, in the months before his death, listening to music in his chamber in the evenings, in the secluded pleasure that the painful condition of his body had not entirely taken from him. He was a serious athlete. He played tennis, in the form of the game that the era called real tennis, which was played in a particular kind of indoor court with a complex set of rules and a degree of skill that the modern game has somewhat simplified. He played at a level that contemporary observers, including some who had seen the best players of the European courts, considered genuinely high. He jousted in the great tournaments that the Tudor court hosted with considerable frequency, with the sort of physical commitment that occasionally produced injuries that he was lucky to survive. He hunted on horseback for entire days at a stretch, and the energy of his hunting expeditions was such that he routinely exhausted the horses that he rode, requiring a string of fresh mounts to be kept ready for him through the day. He wrestled, he fenced, he shot the longbow in the English national sport at a level that the master archers of his court regarded with respect. He was a serious scholar. The education that had been intended for the church had given him a thorough grounding in Latin and theology, and in the early years of his reign, when the great theological controversy of the era began to develop with the work of Martin Luther, Henry took an active personal interest. In 1521, when he was 30, he wrote, with whatever assistance he received from his theological advisers, a book called The Defense of the Seven Sacraments, which was a substantial response to Luther's attack on the traditional Catholic teaching about the sacraments. The book was published in Latin, sent to Pope Leo X, and received with considerable approval. The Pope, in recognition of the book, awarded Henry the title of Defender of the Faith, which was the title the English crown had been hoping to receive in any case, as a mark of its standing among the Catholic monarchies of Europe. The title, by one of the more enjoyable accidents of historical inheritance, has remained with the English monarch ever since. Despite the extensive religious changes of the subsequent decades, and the current monarch still bears it on the coinage of the realm, he was, in his early years, the sort of king that the Renaissance ideal had imagined. He was the prince described in the works of the Italian humanists, the cultivated, educated warrior monarch who combined the accomplishments of body and mind in a single figure. He was, in the eyes of his early subjects, a kind of national fulfillment, the embodiment in his own person of the qualities that the country had hoped for after the long civil disorders of the previous century. The popularity of the young Henry in the first decade of his reign was substantial and broadly based. The merchants of London, the nobility of the country, the scholars of the universities, the common people of the small towns and the villages all looked at the young king with a kind of national pride that the more difficult years of his later reign would gradually erode. I do not want to romanticize this period. The young Henry was, in addition to his virtues, a young man of considerable arrogance and considerable temper. He had been raised, after Arthur's death, with the indulgence that a sole male heir to a contested throne tended to receive. He was used to having his own way. He was capable, in moments of frustration, of the sort of explosive anger that produced among the courtiers of his early years a steady undertone of caution about how to manage him in his less generous moods. He was, in some respects, a young man whose abilities had not yet been adequately tested by anything that could really challenge him, and the qualities that would, in his later years, become the marks of his tyranny were already present, in their embryonic form, in the qualities that his early courtiers had to learn to navigate. The marriage to Catherine of Aragon, which was the great personal relationship of the first half of Henry's reign, deserves a longer pause, because the story of how it began, what it became, and how it eventually ended is the story of the entire transformation of the English Church and the English state in the 16th century, and the personal and the political dimensions of it cannot really be separated. Catherine, when Henry married her in June 1509, was a young woman of considerable accomplishment in her own right. She had been born in 1485, the same year that her future father-in-law had won the crown at Bosworth, and she had been raised in the unusually intellectual atmosphere of the Spanish court of her parents, Ferdinand and Isabella. She had received an education that was, by the standards of the era, extraordinary for a woman. She had been taught Latin fluently by Italian humanists imported into the Spanish court for the purpose. She had been given a thorough grounding in scripture and in theology. She had been instructed in the accomplishments of an aristocratic woman, music and dancing and embroidery. But the central feature of her education had been the genuinely serious intellectual training that her mother, Isabella, who was herself a woman of considerable intellect, had wanted for her daughters. Catherine, by the time she came to England at 15 for her marriage to Arthur, was one of the best educated princesses in Europe. Her arrival in England in October 1501 had been one of the great public events of the early Tudor era. She had travelled from Spain in a fleet of ships that had been delayed by storms in the Bay of Biscay, and she had landed at Plymouth in the autumn of that year, where she had been received by the senior figures of the English court who had been sent to greet her. The progress from Plymouth to London, which had taken several weeks, had been the sort of ceremonial procession that the era reserved for the most important state occasions, with crowds gathering in every town along the route to see the young Spanish princess who would in due course become the Queen of England. The marriage to Arthur, which had taken place in November 1501 at the old St. Paul's Cathedral in London, had been the great public ceremony of that autumn, and the young couple, when they had appeared together in the processions and entertainments that followed the wedding, had presented to the watching crowds the sort of dynastic confidence that the early Tudors had been working to project. Catherine, in the accounts of her appearance at this period, was described by contemporary observers as a young woman of considerable charm, with the auburn hair and the fair complexion that the Spanish royal family had inherited from their English Plantagenet ancestors several generations earlier. And she made, in her first months in England, the sort of favourable impression that the young Henry, who was then 10, and who saw her in the ceremonial appearances that the early months of her time in England produced, would carry with him into his own subsequent dealings with her. She had also been raised with the sort of religious seriousness that the Spanish court of her parents had cultivated. Ferdinand and Isabella had been the monarchs who had completed the long Reconquista, the recovery of Spain from Muslim rule, and who had presided over the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. The religious atmosphere of the court was intense, and Catherine had absorbed from her childhood the particular kind of Catholic devotion that her mother and her father exemplified. She prayed several times a day. She attended Mass with considerable frequency. She kept the fasts and observances of the Catholic year with personal scrupulousness. She was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most genuinely religious women of her generation, and the religion that she practiced was the deep traditional Catholicism that her mother had taught her. The years of her widowhood in England, between Arthur's death in 1502 and her marriage to Henry in 1509, had been difficult years for her. She had been, in effect, a kind of diplomatic hostage, with her future undecided and her finances uncertain, dependent on the goodwill of the English king and on the slow correspondence with her parents. She had managed these years with considerable dignity, maintaining a small household at the royal palaces where she was lodged, conducting herself with the gravity that her position required, and waiting for the eventual resolution of her situation. The marriage to Henry, when it came, was the resolution she had been hoping for, and her gratitude for the rescue from her uncertain widowhood was by all accounts real. The first 10 or 12 years of the marriage were, by every contemporary indication, a happy marriage. Henry and Catherine, despite the difference in their ages and the somewhat awkward circumstances of their early acquaintance, became, over time, a genuinely affectionate couple. They worked together in the management of the kingdom, with Catherine acting as regent during Henry's absence on military campaign in France in 1513, when she organised the defence of the realm against the Scottish invasion that culminated in the great English victory at Flodden. They participated together in the elaborate ceremonial life of the Tudor court, with Catherine taking her place at Henry's side in the pageants and entertainments that filled the calendar of the early years. They appear in the correspondence and the public records of these years as a working royal couple whose mutual respect and mutual affection were the foundation of the early period of the reign Cymangol. What darkened the marriage, slowly at first, and then with growing intensity, was the question of the succession. Catherine became pregnant for the first time in late 1509, within months of the marriage. The pregnancy in January 1510 ended in a stillbirth. She became pregnant again in the same year. In January 1511, she gave birth to a son who was named Henry after his father, and who was, in the celebrations that followed, hailed across the country as the heir to the throne. 52 days later, the infant Henry died of some childhood illness that the era's medicine could not identify. Catherine became pregnant again. The pregnancy ended in a miscarriage. She became pregnant again. The pregnancy produced a son who was stillborn. She became pregnant again. The pregnancy produced a daughter who was stillborn. She became pregnant again in 1515, and in February 1516 she gave birth to a daughter who survived. The daughter was named Mary, and she would, 3 decades later, become Queen Mary I of England. She was, however, a daughter, and the question of a male heir remained open. Catherine became pregnant again. The pregnancy produced a daughter who was stillborn. She became pregnant for the last time in 1518. The pregnancy produced a daughter who was stillborn or who died within hours of birth. After 1518, when Catherine was 33, the pregnancy stopped. She had been pregnant, by the count of the surviving records, at least 6 and possibly 7 times in 9 years, and she had produced one surviving child, the daughter Mary. The cumulative effect of this reproductive history on Catherine personally and on her marriage was substantial. She was by 1520 a woman of 35 who had spent the entire decade of her late 20s and early 30s in a sequence of pregnancies that had produced almost nothing. Her body, by the testimony of the contemporary observers, had been changed considerably by the experience. She had grown stout. Her face, which had been a youthful, pretty face when she came to England at 15, had become the face of a middle-aged woman whose long sequence of difficult pregnancies had taken a visible physical toll. She remained in her bearing and her dignity, the same Catherine she had always been, but the physical bloom of her youth was gone, and she was, by the standards of her era, no longer a young woman. Henry, in the meantime, was 30 in 1521, and he was at the height of his physical vigour. He beamed through the pregnancies a faithful husband by the standards of the era, with the brief exception of an affair in 1518 with one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, a young woman named Bessie Blount, who had given birth in 1519 to an illegitimate son whom Henry had acknowledged and whom he had named Henry Fitzroy. The existence of Henry Fitzroy is significant for our story, because it demonstrated that Henry was capable of producing healthy male children, and it shifted, in his own thinking, the locus of the succession problem from himself to Catherine. The boy, who was acknowledged as the king's natural son, and who was given the title of Duke of Richmond, was raised in a substantial establishment of his own, and was, in the early 1520s, the only living male child that Henry had produced. The succession problem by the early 1520s was the central political question of the kingdom. Henry was a healthy man in his early 30s, but he was not getting any younger, and the lack of a legitimate male heir was the sort of dynastic vulnerability that the Tudor regime, which had only been on the throne for a generation, could not afford to leave unresolved. The previous dynasty, the Plantagenets, had been brought down precisely by the sort of disputed succession that was now beginning to threaten the Tudors, and Henry, who had grown up in the immediate aftermath of the Wars of the Roses, and who had absorbed from his father the long anxieties of the early Tudor regime, understood with great clarity what the absence of a male heir might mean for the country and for his dynasty. The daughter Mary, who was the only legitimate child, could not, by the conventions of the era, be relied on to inherit the throne in her own right. England had never had a successful queen regnant in its own history, and the example of the brief and disastrous reign of Empress Matilda in the 12th century, which had produced civil war, was the standard precedent that men of Henry's era cited when they considered the possibility of a female succession. The question then, by perhaps 1525 or 1526, was what to do. Catherine, by this point in her late 30s or early 40s, was no longer producing pregnancies, and the chances of her producing a son had become, in any reasonable medical assessment, vanishingly small. The marriage that had once been the great personal happiness of Henry's early reign had become, in the calculation of the king and his advisers, a dynastic dead end. It was at this moment, with the marriage in this state of slow stagnation and the succession problem becoming acute, that Henry's eye fell on a particular young woman of the court, and the great crisis of the reign began. The young woman was Anne Boleyn. I want to pause before going further to say a few words about Anne, because the popular image of her, like the popular image of Henry himself, has been so heavily shaped by the dramatic accounts of her story that the actual person tends to disappear into the legend. The Anne Boleyn of popular memory is a kind of seductress figure, calculating and ambitious, who set out to ensnare the king and who succeeded by her cunning manipulation of his desires. The actual Anne, as the historical record preserves her, was considerably more complex and considerably more interesting than this caricature suggests. She was born somewhere between 1501 and 1507, the exact year being uncertain by the record-keeping conventions of the era. She was the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn, a substantial figure of the English court who had served as a diplomat in some European capitals, and of Elizabeth Howard, who came from one of the great noble families of England. Anne had been raised partly in England and partly in the Netherlands and in France, where her father's diplomatic postings had taken the family. She had spent several years, in her early teens, at the French court, where she had absorbed the manners, the dress, and the cultural sophistication of the most fashionable royal court in Europe. By the time she returned to England in her late teens, she was, by the standards of the English court, an unusually polished young woman with a kind of continental accomplishment that the daughters of the English nobility did not generally have. She was not, by the testimony of contemporary observers, a conventional beauty. Her hair was dark, almost black, in an era when blonde and red hair were the preferred fashion. Her skin was olive rather than the fashionable pale white. She was thin rather than the plumper figure that the era considered ideal. She had, by the descriptions, a long neck, a small mouth, and dark eyes that several observers described as being unusually expressive. She was not, in the conventional sense, the sort of young woman who turned heads in the way that the standard beauties of the era did. She was, however, by the unanimous testimony of the contemporary record, a woman of considerable charm, of considerable wit, and of considerable intellectual energy, and the men who encountered her in the social settings of the court tended to find her, in conversation, more interesting than the conventional beauties around her. She was, in the modern phrase, charismatic in a way that her appearance alone did not predict. She had returned to the English court in 1522 when she was perhaps 18, and had been placed by her father in Catherine of Aragon's household as one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. She had spent the following few years in the standard activities of a young woman in that position, attending the Queen, participating in the court entertainments, and exchanging the small flirtations and friendships of the court that the era's conventions allowed. She had been briefly contracted to marry Lord Henry Percy, the heir to the Earl of Northumberland, but the engagement had been broken off in 1523 by Cardinal Wolsey, who had judged the match unsuitable for reasons that the documentary record does not entirely make clear. Anne, by 1525, was an unmarried young woman of perhaps 21 or 22, established at the court, but without any clear marital prospect, and the men of the court who watched her, as men of the era watched young women in such circumstances, were beginning to take an active interest. I want to pause for a moment on the broken engagement to Henry Percy, because it is one of the more revealing small episodes of Anne's early life. The young Percy, who was the heir to one of the great northern earldoms, had met Anne in the course of his visits to the court in the early 1520s, and the two of them had reached, by the standards of the era, an understanding that amounted to a contract of marriage. The contract was the sort of informal but legally meaningful arrangement that the era recognized, and it would, in normal circumstances, have proceeded to a formal marriage. The arrangement, however, was broken by Wolsey, on instructions that probably came from the king himself, although the precise role of Henry's own interest in Anne at this early stage is not entirely clear. Percy was reprimanded by his father, who had been informed of the situation by Wolsey, and was forced to abandon the contract and to marry instead the woman his family had chosen for him, Mary Talbot, in a marriage that would prove to be deeply unhappy, and that would produce, by the accounts of his subsequent life, considerable regret on Percy's part for the choice he had been forced to make. The episode tells us several things. It tells us that Anne, even as a young woman in her early 20s, was already attracting the sort of serious attention from men of the highest rank that suggested her personal qualities were considerably more substantial than her physical appearance alone would have predicted. It tells us that Henry VIII, by 1523, was probably already taking some interest in her, although the interest at this stage may have been the sort of casual royal interest that did not yet contemplate marriage. It tells us that Anne herself, in her early 20s, was capable of inspiring the sort of personal commitment in a young man like Percy that the more conventional beauties of the court were not always able to produce. The contemporary accounts of her, written by men who knew her in this period, consistently describe her as a young woman whose company was sought after, and whose conversation was found genuinely enjoyable, even by men who had known many other young women of the court. The king's interest in her began at some point in 1525 or 1526. The exact moment is not preserved in the documentary record. What we have is the gradual accumulation of evidence that Henry, by the middle of 1526, was paying serious attention to Anne, and that the attention had progressed, by the end of that year, into the sort of pursuit that the king occasionally directed at one of the young women of the court. Anne's older sister, Mary Boleyn, had been Henry's mistress for a period of perhaps 2 or 3 years in the early 1520s, and Henry's pattern in his extramarital interests had been to pursue a young woman until he secured her, to maintain her as his mistress for some period, and then to move on. The standard expectation when his interest in Anne became apparent was that she would in due course become his next mistress in the same pattern. The 7-year pursuit that followed was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary period in the personal life of an English king. Henry wrote to Anne, during the periods when they were apart, in letters that have survived in the Vatican archives, having been seized by agents and ended up in Roman custody by the accidents of the political situation. The letters, which are preserved in Henry's own hand and which constitute one of the most personally revealing bodies of correspondence from the entire reign, give us a picture of the king as a man genuinely in love, in the romantic sense that the modern reader recognizes, with the features of personal devotion and personal anxiety that any man genuinely in love produces. He worries about her health. He worries about whether she is still committed to him. He worries about the political complications that are slowing the resolution of their situation. He sends her gifts, including a small piece of game that he has shot himself, and asks her to think of him when she eats it. He signs his letters with the domestic signature, the linked letters HR signifying Henry the King, with the abbreviation AB for Anne Boleyn enclosed within them in a heart shape that gives us, in its small visual gesture, the romantic intensity of the period from his perspective. What did not happen, however, was that Anne accepted the role of mistress. The exact dynamics of her refusal are one of the most disputed questions in the historical record of the period. Some historians have argued that Anne, who was a young woman of unusual sophistication and unusual intelligence, simply calculated that the role of king's mistress was beneath what she could achieve, and that she held out for marriage by deliberate strategic choice. Other historians have argued that Anne genuinely had no intention of marrying the king when she first refused him, and that her refusal was based on the more conventional grounds of moral and reputational concern, with the marriage proposition only emerging as Henry's frustration with her resistance led him to consider more drastic options. The truth probably lies somewhere between these two accounts. Anne was almost certainly aware of her own value in the marriage market, and she was almost certainly capable of strategic thinking about her position. She was also, however, a young woman with her own dignity and her own reputational concerns, and her refusal of the standard mistress role was probably motivated, at least in part, by the genuine reluctance of a respectable young woman to enter into a relationship that the conventions of her era considered shameful. What is clear from the surviving evidence is that Henry's frustration with Anne's refusal grew over the course of 1526 and 1527, and that by the middle of 1527 he had begun to consider the possibility that the right answer to the problem was not to abandon his pursuit of Anne, but to abandon his marriage to Catherine. The argument that he developed, with the assistance of his theological advisers and with the considerable encouragement of his own conscience, was that the marriage to Catherine had been invalid from the beginning, on the grounds that the canon law of the era prohibited a man from marrying his deceased brother's wife, and that the papal dispensation that had been granted in 1503 to allow the marriage had been improper. The biblical text on which this argument depended was a passage in the book of Leviticus, which prohibited a man from uncovering the nakedness of his brother's wife, and which warned that any couple who entered such a marriage would be childless. Henry, who knew his scripture well from his early theological education, became convinced in the course of 1527 that the long sequence of pregnancies that had failed to produce a surviving male heir was the divine punishment for his violation of this biblical prohibition. The fact that Catherine had borne him a daughter, Mary, who had survived, was a complication that the biblical argument had to manage, but Henry's theological advisers found ways to handle the complication, and the king himself, by the end of 1527, was satisfied that the argument was sound. The position he had reached by the early months of 1528 was that his marriage to Catherine had been invalid from the beginning, that the divine displeasure manifested in the failure of the marriage to produce a male heir was the visible evidence of its invalidity, that the dispensation by which Pope Julius II had purported to authorize the marriage had been beyond the Pope's actual authority to grant, and that he, Henry, was therefore not validly married and had been free, all along, to marry someone else. The someone else by this point was clearly Anne Boleyn, although the public claim was simply that Henry was seeking the resolution of a question of conscience that had been troubling him for some time. The request, when it was made formally to the Pope through the offices of Cardinal Wolsey, was for an annulment of the marriage on the grounds that I have just described. Such requests were not, in the canon law of the era, unprecedented. Some previous monarchs had received annulments on similar grounds, and the political mechanisms by which such requests were managed were reasonably well established. The expectation of Henry and his advisers, at the beginning of the process in 1527, was that the request would be granted, with the usual delays and the usual diplomatic complications, but in essence as a routine matter, and that he would be free to marry Anne within perhaps 2 or 3 years. What had not been adequately accounted for in this expectation was the political situation of the Pope. Pope Clement VII, who had succeeded Leo X in 1523, was at the time of Henry's request a very nearly powerless figure. In May 1527, the imperial troops of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, had sacked Rome in the great catastrophe known as the Sack of Rome, and the Pope, who had taken refuge in the Castel Sant'Angelo, was effectively a prisoner of the imperial forces. The political dependence of the Pope on the Emperor, which the sack of Rome had made absolute, was the great difficulty that Henry's request would now have to navigate, because Charles V was, by the genealogical accident of European royal politics, the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. Charles's mother had been Joanna of Castile, who had been Catherine's older sister. The annulment of Catherine's marriage to Henry would have been a substantial diplomatic insult to the emperor's family, and the Pope, who depended on the emperor for his political survival, was in no position to grant such an annulment. The 8 years between Henry's first request for the annulment in 1527 and the eventual resolution of the question through the break with Rome in 1534 are one of the great extended diplomatic and theological dramas of European history. They involved several different attempts to resolve the question through some legal and ecclesiastical mechanisms. They involved the steady transformation of the political and religious landscape of England, as the king's frustration with the delays produced a series of more and more drastic attempts to break the impasse. They involved the rise to power of Thomas Cranmer, who became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1533, and who would prove to be the architect of the eventual settlement. They involved the fall of Cardinal Wolsey in 1529, when the cardinal's failure to deliver the annulment cost him the king's favour and ultimately his life, although Wolsey died of natural causes on his way to face charges of treason rather than at the hands of the executioner. They involved the rise of Thomas Cromwell, who replaced Wolsey as the king's principal minister, and who designed the legal and parliamentary mechanism by which the eventual break with Rome was actually accomplished. They involved a great deal of pain for Catherine of Aragon, who refused, throughout the entire process, to accept that her marriage was invalid, who maintained, with the same dignity that she had maintained throughout her life, that she had been the king's true wife, and who endured the cruelties that her position now exposed her to without ever, by any contemporary account, surrendering the position she had taken. I want to spend a moment on Catherine in this period. because her conduct through the long crisis is, in my view, one of the most genuinely impressive aspects of the entire story, and the popular accounts of the era tend to treat her, when they treat her at all, as a kind of stationary obstacle that the dramatic action of Henry and Anne had to navigate around. The actual Catherine was considerably more substantial than this treatment suggests. She was, when the crisis began in 1527, 41 years old. She had been Henry's wife for 18 years. She had given him her body through 6 or 7 pregnancies, of which only one had produced a surviving child. She had been faithful to him, by every reasonable indication, throughout the marriage. She had served him competently and loyally as queen. She had raised in the daughter Mary, the only living legitimate child of the marriage. She had no reasonable expectation, by 1527, of any happiness in the latter part of her life beyond the continuation of the marriage and the slow dignified maturation of her position as queen and queen mother. What was being asked of her in the proposed annulment was that she accept that the marriage had been invalid from the beginning, that her daughter Mary was therefore illegitimate, that her own status as queen had been a kind of long misunderstanding, and that she should now retire quietly into some convent or other suitable retirement and allow the king to marry someone else. She was being asked, in effect, to participate in her own erasure. The cost to her personally, if she had agreed to the annulment, would have included not only the loss of her marriage, but the loss of her daughter's status, the loss of her own honour, and the loss of the religious certainty that had been the foundation of her entire life, since the agreement to the annulment would have required her to accept that she had been living all these years in a relationship that the Catholic Church now considered to have been improper. She refused. From the moment the question was first raised in 1527 until her death in January 1536, Catherine maintained with absolute consistency the position that she had been Henry's lawful wife, that her marriage to Arthur had not been consummated and was therefore not a true marriage, that the dispensation granted by Pope Julius II had been valid, and that she would not, under any circumstances, agree to the annulment that Henry was demanding. She made this case in formal proceedings before the Legatine Court at Blackfriars in 1529, in a famous speech that she delivered on her knees before Henry himself, in which she appealed to him as her husband and her king, and asked him to consider, before the eyes of God, what she had done to deserve the treatment she was receiving. The speech, which was recorded by contemporary observers and which has come down to us in considerable detail, is one of the great pieces of personal eloquence of the entire Tudor era, and it captures something essential about Catherine that the modern reader can still recognise. She was a woman who had been wronged. She knew it. She said so. She did not, however, lose her dignity in saying so. The speech was given with the full ceremony of her position, in the language of formal address, and it ended with her standing up, leaving the court, and refusing to participate further in the proceedings. The court, which had no power to compel her presence, could not produce the annulment without her cooperation, and the failure of the Legatine Court was in this respect her doing. The years that followed from 1529 until her death were years of progressive ill-treatment that she absorbed with a steadiness that I find, in the historical record, almost unbearable to read about. She was separated from her daughter Mary, whom she would never see again. She was moved in stages from less and less suitable accommodation to more and more isolated locations. Her household, which had once been the substantial royal establishment of a queen, was reduced to a small staff of loyal attendants. Her income was cut. Her formal position as queen was, by the legal and ecclesiastical mechanisms of the period, gradually stripped away, until by the end of her life she was being addressed only as the Princess Dowager, the title of the widow of Prince Arthur, which was the position she had occupied before her marriage to Henry. She refused throughout to accept this demotion. She continued to sign her letters as Catherine the Queen. She continued to keep the household chapel and the religious observances of a queen. She continued in her small circle of loyal attendants and in her correspondence with her nephew the Emperor and with her supporters in England to be the queen she had been when Henry married her in 1509. She died in January 1536 at Kimbolton Castle in the cold flat country of the East Midlands. She was 50. The cause of death, by the contemporary medical assessment, was probably what we would now call a heart attack, although the autopsy that was performed found a black growth on her heart that some contemporary observers and some modern historians have suggested might have been a cancer. She wrote, in the days before her death, a final letter to Henry, in which she addressed him as her husband, forgave him the wrongs he had done her, asked him to be a good father to their daughter, and signed herself as his loving wife. The letter is one of the great documents of the era. Henry, when he received it, is reported to have wept. Whether the weeping was the residual genuine feeling of a man who had once loved her, or the small theatrical performance of a king who knew what the moment required, the contemporary observers could not entirely determine. The wedding ring she had been given by Henry in 1509, which she'd worn through the 26 years of the marriage, was found on her hand when she was prepared for burial. She was buried at Peterborough Cathedral, in the simple grave that her reduced position required, although the modern visitor can still see the spot, with its tomb plaque that names her, with appropriate dignity, as Catherine, Queen of England. I have given this much time to Catherine because the popular accounts of Henry's reign tend to skate past her, and because her endurance through the long ordeal is, in my view, one of the most impressive personal performances of the entire era. She did not, by any reasonable measure, deserve what was done to her. She bore it, however, with a steadiness and a dignity that the modern reader can still recognize as the marks of an unusually strong character. The dramatizations of her story tend to focus on her early years as the young Spanish princess, on her romance with Arthur, on her marriage to Henry, but the years of her real test were the years from 1527 to 1536, and the Catherine of those years was, in my judgment, the most genuinely admirable of all the figures of Henry's court. The mechanism by which the marriage was eventually annulled, and the political and religious revolution that this annulment produced, is a long and intricate story that I want to summarize rather than to walk through in full detail. The essential outline, however, is worth keeping clear. By 1532, Henry had become convinced that the Pope was not going to grant the annulment, because the Emperor would not permit it. He had also become convinced, with the encouragement of Thomas Cromwell, that the Pope's authority over the English Church was, in any case, an unjustified intrusion on the proper sovereignty of the English crown. Cromwell, who was a brilliant administrator and a serious legal thinker, had developed over the course of 1531 and 1532 the constitutional argument that the King of England was, by the ancient laws of the realm, the supreme authority within his own kingdom in all matters spiritual and temporal, and that the Pope's claimed jurisdiction over the English Church was an usurpation that the king was entitled to refuse. The argument, which combined a particular reading of medieval English history with the new ideas about national sovereignty that were emerging from the Reformation theologians, gave Henry the ideological framework he needed to act unilaterally in the matter of his marriage. The actions, when they came in a sequence over the next 2 years. In May 1532, the English Convocation, which was the legislative body of the English clergy, passed the Submission of the Clergy, which acknowledged the king's authority over the church. In January 1533, Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn, who was by this point pregnant. In March 1533, the Act in Restraint of Appeals was passed by Parliament, which prohibited any appeal to Rome on any matter, and which thereby cut the legal link between the English Church and the papacy. In May 1533, Thomas Cranmer, who had been appointed Archbishop of Canterbury earlier that year, presided over the formal court that declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void and his marriage to Anne valid. In September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter who was named Elizabeth. In November 1534, the Act of Supremacy was passed by Parliament, which formally declared the king to be the supreme head of the Church of England. The break with Rome was complete. I want to pause on one element of this sequence, which is the birth of Elizabeth in September 1533, because the birth deserves a moment of attention in its own right. The whole point of the divorce, as you will recall, had been the production of a male heir. The argument that Henry had used to justify the annulment had been that his marriage to Catherine had been cursed by God for its violation of biblical law, and that the absence of a male heir was the divine punishment for that violation. The corollary of this argument was that a new and properly constituted marriage would produce, by divine favour, the male heir that the kingdom required. Henry, in the months leading up to the birth, had been entirely confident that the child would be a son. The preparations for the birth, including the elaborate ceremonial provisions that the era required for the birth of a royal heir, had been made on the assumption that a prince would be born. The proclamations that would be issued upon the birth had been pre-prepared, with the word prince written into them, and with elaborate decorations and seals. The astrologers and the physicians whom Henry had consulted had, in the standard manner of court astrologers and court physicians, confirmed his expectations. The birth, when it came on the 7th of September 1533, produced a daughter. The proclamations had to be hastily corrected with the word prince altered to princess in the documents that were already prepared. The elaborate celebrations that had been planned were considerably scaled back. Henry, who had been confident that the question of the succession was about to be resolved, found himself in essentially the same situation he had been in before the divorce, with a queen who had produced a daughter rather than a son. The daughter, however, was Elizabeth, the daughter who, 50 years later, would become the great queen of the Elizabethan era, who would defeat the Spanish Armada, who would preside over the literary flourishing that produced Shakespeare, who would establish the Protestant settlement of the English Church, who would die in 1603 having reigned for 45 years and having become, by the time of her death, one of the most successful monarchs in English history. The daughter whom Henry, in his disappointment at her birth, did not particularly want, would turn out to be the most consequential of his 3 legitimate children, and the small protests that he made at her birth, which the historical record dutifully preserves, are among the more enjoyable of the small ironies of the era. For the moment, however, in 1533, Henry's reaction to the birth of Elizabeth was disappointment. The disappointment was not, at this stage, fatal to his marriage with Anne. The new queen was 26. There was every reason to expect that she would in due course produce a son. The marriage in the months following Elizabeth's birth continued in essentially the pattern that had been established before. Anne and Henry, who had been in a state of romantic intensity for the 7 years of his pursuit, settled into the routine of a working royal marriage with the ceremonial and political duties that the position required. The next 2 years, however, did not go as Anne and Henry had hoped. Anne became pregnant again in 1534. The pregnancy, by the accounts, ended in either a miscarriage or a stillbirth in the summer of that year. She became pregnant again in 1535. The pregnancy ended, in January 1536, in a miscarriage that produced a male fetus, which Anne was reported to have miscarried on the day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral. The coincidence of the dates was the sort of thing that the era's symbolic interpretation of events did not let pass unnoticed. The miscarriage, which destroyed the male heir that the entire revolution had been designed to produce, was the moment at which Henry's commitment to Anne began to falter. I want to walk carefully through what happened next, because the fall of Anne Boleyn in 1536 is one of the most contested and most psychologically complex events of the entire reign, and the interpretations of it have produced a substantial historical literature. The bare facts are these. In the spring of 1536, between February and May, Henry's relationship with Anne deteriorated rapidly. The reasons for the deterioration are not entirely clear from the documentary record, but they appear to have included the miscarriage in January, the king's growing interest in another young woman of the court named Jane Seymour, and a series of political and personal frictions that had been accumulating for some time. By April, the king had instructed his minister Thomas Cromwell to investigate the conduct of the Queen with a view to determining whether grounds existed for some kind of action against her. Cromwell, who had his own political reasons for wanting Anne removed, conducted the investigation with considerable energy. By the end of April, charges had been formulated against Anne and against 5 men of the court, who were accused of having been her lovers in adulterous relationships that, in the case of a queen, constituted treason against the king. The charges included accusations of adultery with 4 men of the court, including the courtier Sir Henry Norris, the musician Mark Smeaton, and others. They also included an accusation of incest with Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. The charges were, by any modern legal standard, deeply implausible. The dates and locations of the alleged offences, when they were specified, included occasions on which the parties were demonstrably elsewhere, or on which Anne was demonstrably pregnant or recovering from childbirth. The charges had the appearance, to most modern historians who have studied the documentary record, of a fabrication produced by Cromwell and his associates to give legal cover to a political decision that had already been made. I do not want to draw out the details of the trial, which produced, in May 1536, the convictions that the king had wanted. Anne and her brother and the other men were tried and condemned. The 5 men were executed on the 17th of May. Anne was executed on the 19th of May. She was the first English queen to be executed for treason. She was perhaps 35 years old, although the uncertainty of her birth date makes the figure approximate. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower of London, where her remains still rest today. The marriage between her and Henry had lasted 3 years and 4 months. The daughter Elizabeth, who was now 2 years old, was declared illegitimate, just as Mary had been declared illegitimate 3 years earlier, and the king was once again without a legitimate heir. I find the fall of Anne, in some respects, the most disturbing single episode of Henry's reign. Catherine had been treated unjustly, but she had been allowed to live, and her death in 1536 was a natural one. Anne, who had been the king's choice and his great romantic obsession for nearly a decade, was destroyed by him with a swiftness and a thoroughness that suggested something genuinely dark in his character, something that had perhaps always been there, but that had not, until now, found its full occasion. The Henry who married Catherine of Aragon in 1509 had not, I think, been the sort of man who could have done what was done to Anne in 1536. The Henry who did this was a different man, and the question of when and how the change occurred is one of the central questions of his biography. 11 days after Anne's execution, on the 30th of May 1536, Henry married Jane Seymour. The marriage to Jane was the marriage that had, in the strict sense, been the cause of Anne's destruction, since it was the king's growing interest in Jane in the early months of 1536 that had set in motion the political process that ended with Anne's death. Jane was the third of Henry's 6 wives, and she is in some ways the most difficult of them to characterize, because the documentary record of her life is the thinnest of all the queens. She was perhaps 28 when she married Henry, which made her, by the standards of the era, a slightly older bride. She came from a country gentry family of moderate standing, the Seymours of Wolf Hall in Wiltshire. She had served, like Anne before her, as a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, and then to Anne herself. She was, by the contemporary accounts, a quiet and pious young woman of unremarkable appearance and modest accomplishment, the sort of figure who would, in any other circumstances, have made a respectable marriage to a country gentleman, and lived out her life in obscurity. The accident by which she became Queen of England was a function of the king's eye falling on her at exactly the moment when the disposal of Anne was becoming politically necessary, and the question of what kind of person she actually was behind the modest public presentation is one that the historical record does not entirely allow us to answer. The marriage, however brief, was apparently a happy one. Jane and Henry, in the 18 months of their union, presented to the public the image of a settled royal couple, with the sort of mutual contentment that the king had not entirely managed to produce with either of his previous queens. Jane became pregnant in early 1537. The pregnancy proceeded uneventfully through the summer and autumn. On the 12th of October 1537, at Hampton Court Palace, she gave birth to a son. The son was Edward, the male heir whom Henry had been seeking, through 3 marriages and 10 years of upheaval, had finally been produced. The relief and the joy with which Henry received the news by all the contemporary accounts was substantial and visible. The country celebrated. The bells of every church in London rang for hours. The bonfires were lit in every town. The hopes of the dynasty, which had been balanced on the edge for a generation, were now finally secured. 12 days after the birth, on the 24th of October 1537, Jane Seymour died. The cause of death, by the contemporary medical assessment, was the puerperal fever that was the standard killer of women in childbirth in the era. The childbirth itself had been a difficult one, and the medical interventions that had been made to assist it had probably introduced the infection that killed her. She was perhaps 29. She had been queen for 17 months. She was buried at Windsor, in the tomb that Henry would eventually share with her by the request he made before his own death 10 years later. She was the only one of his 6 wives whom he chose to be buried beside, and the choice tells us, in its small way, what she had meant to him. Henry, after Jane's death, entered a period of genuine mourning that was unusual for him. He wore black for some weeks. He withdrew from court entertainments. He delayed, for 2.5 years, the question of his next marriage in a way that was not characteristic of his usual response to loss. The death of Jane, by the testimony of the contemporary observers, affected him in a way that none of his other domestic losses had done. She had been, in his experience of marriage, the queen who had given him what he wanted without producing any of the difficulties that his previous queens had produced. She had given him a son. She had not, by her insistence on her own rights, complicated the political situation of the kingdom. She had not, by her sequence of pregnancies, exhausted his patience with her. She had, in the simplest sense, been the wife who had performed the role correctly, and her death had taken her from him before any difficulties had time to develop. The young son, Edward, was given to a household of nurses and tutors who would raise him through the standard upbringing of a Tudor prince. He was a delicate child from his earliest months, prone to the respiratory illnesses that the era's medicine could not effectively treat. He was, by the reports, an intellectually precocious child who developed an unusually serious religious commitment in his early years, partly through the influence of the Protestant tutors his father appointed for him in the late 1530s and early 1540s. He would, in due course, become King Edward VI in 1547 at the age of 9, and would reign for 6 years before dying of tuberculosis in 1553 at the age of 15, never having married and never having produced an heir of his own. The male heir whom Henry had spent a decade and a half pursuing would, in the end, prove to be a transient figure in the dynastic story, with the throne passing back, after his death, to his half-sister Mary and then to his other half-sister Elizabeth, in the succession that the original break with Rome had been designed to prevent. The nursery in which Edward spent his earliest years was established at Hampton Court Palace, in the suite of rooms that Henry had set aside for the heir apparent, and it was supervised by a substantial establishment of servants whose only responsibility was the care and protection of the small prince. The nurses, the dry nurses, the rockers of the cradle, the attendants who managed the small daily activities of an infant prince, numbered, in their cumulative count, perhaps 30 or 40 people. The standards of cleanliness in the nursery, by the orders that Henry had personally issued, were higher than the standards that the era usually maintained in royal households, with the rooms cleaned and the linens changed with a frequency that reflected the king's anxiety about the survival of his only legitimate male heir. Visitors to the nursery, including senior figures of the court, were required to wash their hands and to change their clothing before approaching the child, in the precautions that the era's medicine, which understood the basic principles of contagion, if not the underlying biology, considered sensible. The infant Edward, who was the most precious child in the kingdom by any reasonable measure, was protected from the risks of his environment with the sort of careful attention that the era's resources could provide, and the fact that he survived to childhood, when so many royal children of the era did not, was a tribute to the care that was lavished on him in these early years. He was, by all the contemporary accounts, a serious child from his earliest years, with the sort of grave, attentive manner that the visitors to the nursery remarked on, with a combination of admiration and some small concern about whether a child so serious would, in his eventual development, possess the warmer human qualities that a successful king would also need. The question, in the event, was not put to a serious test, since Edward died too young to develop into the king he would have become, and the small grave child of the Hampton Court nursery would remain, in the historical record, a figure of considerable promise rather than of considerable achievement. For the moment, however, in 1537, the male heir existed and was apparently healthy, and the immediate succession problem had been solved. I want to step back here from the marriages and consider some of the other aspects of Henry's reign that the focus on the wives tends to crowd out, because the reign was about considerably more than the marital adventures of the king, and the political and religious transformations that occurred during it have shaped the history of England in ways that the marital story does not quite capture. The break with Rome, which I have treated as a kind of byproduct of the divorce question, was in fact one of the most consequential religious revolutions in English history. The English Church, before 1534, had been an integral part of the Universal Catholic Church, with its bishops appointed in cooperation with Rome, its theology determined by the councils and the papal pronouncements of the Universal Church, its monasteries and religious houses organized according to the rules of the international religious orders, its liturgy conducted in the Latin of the Roman Rite. The break with Rome, when it came, did not at first change all of these things. The English Church under Henry remained in its theology and its liturgy recognizably Catholic. The principal change in 1534 was the substitution of the king for the pope as the supreme head of the church. The doctrines and the practices in the immediate aftermath of the break remained largely as they had been. What followed, however, in the second half of the 1530s was the dissolution of the monasteries, which was a much more substantial transformation of the religious and economic life of the country. The monasteries of England, which had been built up over the previous 900 years, constituted, by 1535, a substantial element of the country's economic and social structure. There were perhaps 800 religious houses of sizes scattered across the country. They held between them perhaps a quarter of all the land in England. They housed perhaps 10,000 monks, friars, and nuns. They provided in their capacities a significant amount of the country's medical care, education, hospitality for travellers, and charitable provision for the poor. They were, in their cumulative effect, one of the great institutions of medieval English life. The dissolution which Cromwell organised between 1536 and 1540 was the systematic suppression of all of these houses, the seizure of their lands and treasures by the Crown, and the dispersal of their inhabitants into the secular world, or, in the case of those who refused to go quietly, into prison. The smaller houses were dissolved first in 1536, on the grounds that they were too small to be properly maintained. The larger houses were dissolved next in stages, on several pretexts that the documentary record makes clear, were in most cases simply legal cover for what was at heart a massive transfer of wealth from the church to the crown. By 1540, when the great abbey of Waltham was the last to surrender, every monastery and friary in the country had been suppressed. The economic consequences of the dissolution were enormous. The land that had been held by the monasteries was, in most cases, sold off by the crown to the gentry and the nobility of the country, in transactions that produced considerable income for Henry's treasury, and that produced, simultaneously, a substantial transfer of wealth and influence to a particular class of new landowners whose loyalty to the new religious settlement was secured by their financial interest in its continuation. The dissolution, in this respect, was one of the great political achievements of the reign, because it created, in a single decade, a powerful constituency of beneficiaries who would resist any future attempt to undo the religious revolution and to restore the monasteries to the church. The dissolution, in its political effects, was the mechanism by which the break with Rome was made permanent. The cultural consequences were also enormous, and they are worth pausing on, because the destruction of the monasteries involved the destruction of the great repositories of medieval English culture that the religious houses had maintained. The monastic libraries, which had preserved the manuscripts of the medieval English literary, theological, and historical tradition, were, in most cases, broken up. Many of the manuscripts were lost. Some were dispersed into private hands and eventually re-emerged in the great collections of the Elizabethan and Stuart antiquaries. Some were used with what now seems like astonishing carelessness, as kindling, as wrapping paper, as book bindings for new books. The cumulative loss to the cultural record of medieval England was substantial, and modern historians and literary scholars are still, several centuries later, coming to terms with what was destroyed. The religious art of the monasteries was destroyed on a similar scale. The medieval English tradition of religious painting, sculpture, and stained glass, which had developed over the previous 500 years to a considerable level of accomplishment, was, in the dissolution and in the iconoclastic campaigns that followed it, almost entirely destroyed. The painted walls of the parish churches, which had constituted one of the great popular art forms of medieval England, were whitewashed over. The statues of the saints which had stood in the niches of the churches for generations were broken up. The stained glass windows were smashed. The small devotional objects of the medieval religious life, the rosaries and the pilgrim badges and the small painted panels and the relics of the local saints, were either destroyed outright or hidden away by the families who could not bring themselves to part with them. The visible religious culture of medieval England, which had developed over a millennium, was, in a single decade, essentially erased from the country. The human cost of the dissolution on the people who had been members of the religious orders varied considerably with the circumstances of the particular house and the particular individual. The monks and nuns of the smaller houses were, in most cases, simply turned out, with small pensions in some cases, and with nothing in others, into a world that they were not equipped to navigate. Many of them returned to their families, where they were absorbed back into the secular life that they had often left as children. Some of them, in the case of the priests, became parish clergy in the newly Protestantizing church. Some of them found employment as schoolmasters or as private chaplains or in the secular roles that their education made possible. Some of them, particularly the older monks and nuns whose entire adult lives had been spent in the religious houses, did not adapt well to secular life and ended their days in poverty and obscurity. The dissolution, in this respect, produced a scattered population of dispossessed religious, whose individual fates the documentary record cannot easily trace, but whose cumulative experience constitutes one of the great social dislocations of the era. The most painful aspects of the dissolution, however, fell on those who refused to accept it. The abbots and priors of several of the larger houses, who held out against the king's demands, were tried and executed. The monks of the Carthusian order, in particular, who had a long tradition of strict observance, and who refused, on grounds of conscience, to acknowledge the king's supremacy over the church, were treated with a particular cruelty. Several of them were executed in 1535 and 1536, in deaths whose specifics I will not describe in detail, but which were, by any reasonable standard, exceptionally harsh even for the era. The Carthusians, who had been one of the most respected religious orders in England, were essentially wiped out as a community in the years of the dissolution, and the survival of any of them at all into the next century was a matter of small accident and individual escape. There was also, during the dissolution, a substantial popular reaction in the parts of the country where the religious houses had been most deeply embedded in the local economic and social life. The greatest of these reactions was the rising in the north of England in 1536, which has come to be known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. The rising began in Lincolnshire in October of that year, in protest against the dissolution of the smaller houses, and against the other religious changes that the Cromwellian reforms had introduced. It spread rapidly into Yorkshire and across the north, and at its height it involved perhaps 30 or 40,000 armed men, organised under the leadership of a Yorkshire lawyer named Robert Aske, marching under banners that bore the image of the 5 wounds of Christ. The Pilgrimage of Grace was, by the standards of the era, a substantial popular movement. The numbers involved were larger than any English army that Henry could quickly assemble. The grievances of the participants were genuine, broadly shared, and politically serious. The threat to the regime in the autumn and winter of 1536 was the greatest internal threat that Henry had faced in his entire reign. Henry's response to it was a combination of negotiation and treachery that gives us, I think, a clear picture of the sort of king he had become by this point in his reign. He sent Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, north to negotiate with the rebels. Norfolk, on Henry's instructions, agreed to substantial concessions, including the suspension of the dissolutions and the calling of a parliament in the north to address the grievances of the rebels. Aske and the other leaders, who took these promises in good faith, persuaded their followers to disperse and return home. Aske himself was invited to spend Christmas at the court, where Henry received him with apparent warmth. Within weeks of the dispersal, Henry repudiated the agreements that Norfolk had made. He arrested Aske and the other leaders. He executed them, along with several hundred of the lesser participants in the rising, in a sequence of trials and executions that ran through the spring and summer of 1537. Aske himself was hanged in chains at York. The other leaders were executed in their own home counties, as a public demonstration of the consequences of opposition to the king. The rising, which had been the greatest popular protest of the reign, was ended not by the military victory of Henry's forces, which had not occurred, but by the king's deliberate breach of the terms by which the rising had been resolved. I think this episode tells us something important about the Henry of the late 1530s. The young Henry of 1509 had not, I think, been the sort of man who could have done this. The Henry of 1537 was. The transformation of his character, which was the central psychological story of the reign, had reached by this point the stage at which the king was willing to violate the most basic conventions of honour and good faith in order to achieve his political ends. The willingness to do this, in the manner that he did it, was a marker of the man he had become. I want to address, before we go further, the question of what produced this transformation, because it is one of the most discussed questions in Henry's biography, and the historians who have studied the reign have offered a range of answers. One element of the answer is physical. Henry, in 1536, had a serious accident in a tournament at Greenwich, when he was thrown from his horse and the horse fell on him. He was unconscious for 2 hours after the accident, and the contemporary observers who saw him in the immediate aftermath thought he might die. He survived, but the injuries he had sustained, particularly the injuries to his legs, did not heal cleanly. He developed over the following years a chronic ulcer on one of his legs that would not close, that produced periodic bouts of severe pain and infection, and that limited, in increasing degrees, his physical activity. The handsome athletic king of the early years, who had hunted on horseback for whole days at a stretch, was no longer physically capable of those activities by the late 1530s, and he had become, by 1540, a man whose physical condition imposed substantial restrictions on what he could do. The accident itself deserves a longer description, because it was, by any reasonable assessment, the single most consequential physical event of Henry's adult life. The tournament was being held on the 24th of January 1536, in the great tilt yard at Greenwich Palace, in the standard winter season of jousting that the court conducted between Christmas and Lent. Henry was 44. He was, by the standards of his era, on the older end of the range of men who still routinely jousted, but he had continued the activity into his middle age with the sort of physical confidence that had been one of the marks of his early reign. He was wearing the full plate armour of the era, which weighed perhaps 60 pounds, and he was mounted on a heavy war-horse that itself carried perhaps 100 pounds of armour and equipment. He was charging in the standard manner of the joust, down the central barrier of the tilt-yard, with his lance levelled at the approaching opponent. What happened next, in the accounts that survive, was that Henry's horse, for reasons that the contemporary observers could not entirely determine, stumbled or refused at the critical moment, throwing the king forward in his saddle and then collapsing under him. The combined weight of horse and armoured rider, falling onto the hard ground of the tilt-yard, produced injuries to Henry's legs and possibly to his head that were severe enough to render him unconscious for a substantial period. The witnesses who attended to him in the immediate aftermath thought, by the accounts, that he was dead. The news of his apparent death was carried, in the moments that followed, into the interior parts of the palace, where Anne Boleyn, who was at this point pregnant with what would prove to be the male fetus that she miscarried 5 days later, was reported to have received the news with the sort of shock that may have contributed to the loss of the pregnancy. Henry, however, was not dead. He recovered consciousness after some hours. He was carried into his apartments. The physicians of the court attended to him through the following days. The injuries, when they were examined, were assessed as serious but not immediately life-threatening. He was kept in bed for some weeks. He returned, eventually, to the activities of his daily life, although he never again jousted in the great tournaments that had been one of the principal physical pleasures of his early years. The injuries, however, did not heal in the way that the physicians had hoped. The leg, which had been damaged by the fall, developed the chronic ulcer that would torment him for the rest of his life. The head injury, if there had been one, may have produced the kinds of long-term effects on his temperament that the modern medical literature on traumatic brain injury would now recognize, but that the era's medicine could not assess. The chronic pain and the chronic infection of the leg ulcer, taken together, may have produced, by themselves, much of the change in Henry's temperament that the documentary record traces. The medical literature on chronic pain is clear that long-term physical suffering produces, in many patients, the sort of irritability, anger, and impaired judgment that Henry exhibited in the second half of his reign. Whether the changes in his character were, in this sense, primarily a medical phenomenon, or whether they reflected deeper changes in his psychology that the medical condition exacerbated, is a question that the documentary record does not entirely settle. Some modern medical historians have proposed more specific diagnoses. One of the more popular suggestions, which has been argued by scholars over the past several decades, is that Henry suffered some form of head injury from the 1536 fall that produced changes in his frontal lobe function, and that could account for the changes in his temperament and judgment that emerged in subsequent years. The argument is plausible, given what we now know about the long-term effects of head injuries, but it is speculative, since we have no direct evidence of the kind that would allow a confident diagnosis. Other suggestions have included diabetes, syphilis, and some endocrine disorders, with each suggestion explaining some of the symptoms, but none of them accounting for all of them. What is clear from the documentary record is that, whatever the cause, Henry's character did change in the late 1530s and the 1540s, and the change was in the direction of greater paranoia, greater willingness to use violence against those who displeased him, and reduced ability to trust the advisors and family members who had served him faithfully for years. The man who had reigned with such evident pleasure and such genuine popularity in his first decade was, by the 1540s, a king whom the people around him approached with the sort of caution that the survival instincts of courtiers had taught them was now necessary. The fall of Cromwell in 1540 is the next major episode that I want to give you, because it shows the developed pattern of Henry's later years with particular clarity. Thomas Cromwell had been the king's principal minister since 1532. He had organised the break with Rome. He had executed the dissolution of the monasteries. He had, by the late 1530s, accumulated more political power than any English minister had held since Cardinal Wolsey, and he had become, in the small society of the court, one of the most consequential figures of the era. He was a man of considerable ability, and by the standards of his era, considerable personal honesty in his public dealings, although he had also been, throughout his career, the principal instrument by which Henry's some political and personal demands had been translated into practical action. In 1540, Cromwell arranged the marriage of Henry to Anne of Cleves, who was the daughter of a German Protestant duke, in a diplomatic match that was intended to align England with the German Protestant princes against the threat of a possible Catholic alliance between France and the Empire. The marriage, when it occurred, was a personal disaster for Henry. He met Anne for the first time on her arrival in England, and he found her, to his considerable disappointment, physically unattractive in a way that the preliminary reports had not led him to expect. The marriage was conducted on the agreed date, but Henry's lack of interest in his new wife was apparent from the beginning, and within 6 months he was seeking to be released from the marriage. The release was arranged with reasonable speed and considerable diplomatic skill by the same Cromwell who had arranged the marriage in the first place. Anne, who was a sensible and pragmatic woman, agreed to the annulment without resistance. She was given a generous settlement, including substantial estates and a regular income, and she remained in England for the rest of her life, living in considerable comfort as the king's sister, which was the title she was given as part of the settlement. She would, by the reports, become quite friendly with Henry in the years after the annulment, and would attend court on different occasions as a respected member of the king's extended family. She would outlive Henry, dying in 1557, and would be the only one of his 6 wives whom the 4 subsequent decades of English politics did not significantly damage. Her good sense, in the situation she had found herself in, served her better than the more dramatic strategies of some of her predecessors. Cromwell, however, did not survive the failure of the marriage. The political enemies he had accumulated during his years of dominance had been waiting for an opportunity, and the marriage of Anne of Cleves, which had been Cromwell's project and which had ended in the king's disappointment, gave them the opening they needed. They moved against Cromwell in June 1540, with charges of heresy and treason that were, by any modern standard, fabricated, but that did not need to be true to be effective in the political environment of Henry's late court. Cromwell was arrested at a council meeting on the 10th of June. He was tried and condemned by an Act of Attainder, which allowed Parliament to convict him without the formality of a trial. He was executed at the Tower on the 28th of July 1540. He was perhaps 55. The execution of Cromwell, who had served Henry faithfully and brilliantly for 8 years, and who had been the principal architect of the political and religious revolution that had defined the reign, was, in many respects, the great betrayal of Henry's later career. Henry, who came to regret the execution within weeks, blamed his advisors for having pushed him into it, and complained in conversations recorded by the contemporary observers that he had been the victim of the lies of those around him. The complaint was not, by any reasonable assessment, accurate. Henry had agreed to the execution. He had signed the warrant. He had, when the moment came, allowed the man who had served him for nearly a decade to die at his hands. The willingness to do this, when the political moment seemed to require it, was the developed pattern of his later years, and the small subsequent regret was the small subsequent feature of the same pattern. On the same day that Cromwell was executed, the 28th of July 1540, Henry married his fifth wife. Her name was Catherine Howard, and she was a young woman of perhaps 17, the niece of Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, who was the principal political figure at court after the fall of Cromwell. The marriage to Catherine Howard was the marriage of an aging, sick, increasingly difficult king to a young woman who was perhaps a third of his age, and the dynamics of it were the dynamics that the description suggests. Catherine was, by the contemporary accounts, a pretty and lively young woman who had been raised in the somewhat irregular household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where the supervision of young aristocratic girls had been less than rigorous. She had, before her marriage to Henry, at least 2 and possibly 3 relationships with young men of the household, in circumstances that the era considered scandalous, and that, in the case of a queen, would constitute the sort of political vulnerability that any future enemy could use against her. The relationships, when they had occurred, had been the relationships of an inadequately supervised teenage girl in a household that had not provided her with the moral and practical guidance that her position would eventually require. They were not, in the original circumstances, the actions of a calculating adult, but they were, in the political circumstances of her queenship, the kind of past that could destroy her. The marriage, in its first year, appears to have been reasonably contented. Henry, who was 49 and unwell and aging rapidly, found in his young wife a kind of late-life pleasure that the documentary record indicates he genuinely valued. He referred to her in his comments to his courtiers as his rose without a thorn. The phrase, in retrospect, has a particular irony, but at the time of its use it expressed with reasonable accuracy the king's feeling about his new young wife. The disclosure of Catherine's past began in November 1541. The political details of how the disclosure occurred are complex, but the essential story is that one of her former lovers, who had been a member of her household before her marriage to the king, had drunkenly confessed to a neighbour about the relationship, and the neighbour had reported the confession to the authorities. The investigation that followed produced rapid and damning evidence of the Queen's premarital conduct, and, with somewhat less clear evidence, suggestions that she had also conducted an adulterous relationship after her marriage with one of the King's gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, a young man named Thomas Culpeper. The case against Catherine, when it was assembled, was considerably stronger than the case against Anne Boleyn had been. The premarital relationships were genuinely documented and were acknowledged by the parties involved. The post-marital relationship with Culpeper, while the evidence for it was less complete, included the testimony of Catherine's lady-in-waiting Lady Rochford, who was the widow of Anne Boleyn's executed brother George, and who had, by the accounts, facilitated the secret meetings between Catherine and Culpeper. The trial, when it came, produced the same outcome as Anne Boleyn's trial 5.5 years earlier. Catherine was condemned. Culpeper and another young man, Francis Dereham, who had been Catherine's lover before her marriage, and who had subsequently entered her household, were both executed in December 1541. Catherine herself was executed on the 13th of February 1542. She was perhaps 18, although her exact age, like Anne's, is uncertain. Lady Rochford, who had been instrumental in the affair, and who was probably mentally unstable in her later years, was executed alongside her. Catherine was buried, like Anne before her, in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower. I want to handle Catherine's case with care, because it differs in important ways from Anne's. The evidence of premarital sexual experience was real and was acknowledged by Catherine herself. The evidence of the post-marital relationship with Culpeper, while less certain, included Catherine's own admissions of meetings that the era considered improper, even if the question of whether the meetings had progressed to actual adultery remained somewhat ambiguous in the surviving documentary record. Catherine was not, in the way that Anne had been, the victim of a fabricated case constructed for political reasons. She was, in some real sense, what the charges said she was. The justice that was meted out to her was, however, by any modern standard, grotesquely disproportionate to her actual offences. She was a teenage girl who had been used by her family for political purposes, who had been given a role she was not prepared to handle, and who had made the kinds of mistakes that an inadequately educated teenager in her position might be expected to make. The penalty for these mistakes, in the legal system of Henry's late reign, was death. The penalty was applied. She was the second of his wives to be executed in 6 years, and she was, like Anne before her, a young woman whose end was substantially out of proportion to the offences for which she was condemned. Henry, after Catherine's execution, was reported by the contemporary observers to be in a state of considerable depression. He withdrew from much of the social activity of the court. He grew, in the months that followed, visibly older and more difficult. The illusion of late romantic happiness that the marriage to Catherine had briefly provided had been shattered, and the man who emerged from the destruction of it was the man whom the late portraits of Holbein have preserved for us, the heavy paranoid figure of the final years. The sixth and final wife was Catherine Parr, whom Henry married in July 1543. She was by every measure the most accomplished of his 6 wives, and the marriage to her was in many respects the most stable and most genuinely companionable of all his marriages. She is also, however, the wife least well known in popular memory, partly because her relationship with Henry did not produce the dramatic events associated with the previous wives. Catherine Parr was 31 when she married Henry. She was a widow twice over, having previously married 2 older men, the second of whom, Lord Latimer, had died earlier in 1543. She was a woman of considerable education, religious seriousness, and practical competence. She had been raised in a substantial gentry family with strong court connections. She had received the level of intellectual education that daughters of educated Tudor gentry sometimes received. She wrote books, including a substantial work of devotional prose called The Lamentations of a Sinner, which she published after Henry's death, making her one of the first women to publish under her own name in English. She spoke Latin and French and a small amount of Italian. She had Protestant religious sympathies, which she handled with considerable political skill, given the complicated religious situation at Henry's court in his last years. The intellectual circle that Catherine Parr gathered around herself at court is worth longer mention, because it constitutes one of the more interesting cultural achievements of the late reign. She brought to court a group of educated women, including her sister Anne Parr, and several of her ladies-in-waiting, who shared her religious and scholarly interests, and she presided, in the modest private chambers of the Queen's apartments, over intellectual gatherings that the era did not always permit to women. The group read scripture together, in the original Greek and Latin, and in the English translations that the Reformation had produced. They read the works of the new humanist scholars, including the writings of Erasmus and the continental Protestant theologians, whose works had been smuggled into England despite official restrictions on their importation. They discussed in the serious intellectual exchange that the era reserved for educated men the theological and philosophical questions raised by religious change. The young Princess Elizabeth, who joined the household of her stepmother in the last years of Henry's reign, received in this intellectual environment the formative influences that would, in due course, shape the educated and intellectually formidable queen she would eventually become. Catherine Parr, in this respect, was not just the king's nurse and companion in his last years, but the patron of one of the more important small intellectual communities of the era, and her influence on the next generation of educated English women was substantial in ways that the more dramatic stories of the other wives have tended to obscure. She was not, in the romantic sense, the wife whom Henry chose because he was in love with her. She was the wife he chose because, in his late years, he needed an intelligent, companionable presence that her experience and temperament could provide. She managed the role with skill and grace. She nursed Henry through the illnesses of his last years, when his leg ulcers were causing him constant pain and when his temper was at its most difficult. She managed the relationships between Henry and his 3 children, all of whom she befriended and all of whom she helped to educate. She survived 2 political crises during her marriage, when her religious views nearly produced charges of heresy against her by careful management of the king's moods and by the skillful submission that the situation required. She presided in the final years over a court that had become in many ways her own creation, with a circle of intelligent and educated women around her, who would in subsequent decades play significant roles in the further religious and political development of the country. She was, in this respect, the ideal late-life wife for the King Henry had become. She gave him what he needed without demanding what he could not give. She managed, in the care of his children and the maintenance of his household, the practical functions that the Queen's role required. She was, in his last years, the closest thing to a stable adult companion that he was capable of having, and the marriage, in the 3.5 years it lasted before Henry's death, was the most successful of his unions in terms of the practical management of the king's daily life. I want to give you a longer description, before we move toward the close, of what Henry was like physically and personally in his last years, because the contrast with the young king of 1509 is, I think, one of the most striking features of the entire reign, and one of the things that popular accounts of him tend to miss. The Henry of 1546, the year before his death, was a very different physical specimen from the young king who had come to the throne 37 years earlier. He had grown enormously fat. The reasons for the weight gain were a combination of his reduced physical activity following the 1536 accident, his continued substantial consumption of food and drink in the manner of a younger and more active man, and possibly some endocrine condition that the era's medicine could not identify. His armour, which has been preserved at the Royal Armouries and which can still be examined today, gives us the precise dimensions of his body at stages of his life. The young king's armour, made for him in his 20s, has a chest measurement of approximately 42 inches and a waist measurement of approximately 36 inches. The armour from his last years has a chest measurement of approximately 58 inches and a waist measurement of approximately 54 inches. The body inside the late armour was the body of a very large man by any standard. The leg ulcers, which had been chronic since 1536, had grown worse over the intervening decade. They produced in his last years the kind of constant low-grade infection that produced fevers, fatigue, and a particular smell that the contemporary accounts mention with some delicacy. The ulcers, which were treated by the medical interventions that the era allowed, including drainage and the application of poultices, did not heal, but did periodically improve enough to allow him brief intervals of greater mobility before the inevitable relapse. His mobility, in his last years, was substantially impaired. He had been, by the late 1530s, requiring the assistance of a stick to walk for any distance. By the 1540s, he was using a wheeled chair to be moved between the rooms of his palaces. The famous portrait by Holbein that shows him standing in the heroic pose with hands on hips and legs apart, looking directly at the viewer with the kind of confident dominance that the image has come to represent, was painted in 1537, when this kind of pose was still possible for him. By 1545, when the great family portrait at Hampton Court was painted, the king is shown seated, with the visual cues of physical reduction that the artist had to incorporate to produce a credible likeness. His temperament, in the last years, was the temperament of a man who was in constant pain, who was aware that his time was running out, and who was managing, with diminishing success, the political and personal anxieties that his long reign had accumulated. He was prone to outbursts of rage that the people around him had to learn to navigate. He was suspicious of his closest advisers. He was paranoid about plots against him, and the political crises of his last years were, in many cases, produced by his suspicions rather than by any actual conspiracy. He was, however, also capable of genuine kindness in his interactions with the small group of people whom he still trusted, including Catherine Parr and his 3 children, and the picture of him in his last years that the documentary record produces is more complex than the simple cartoon of an aging tyrant. He was, in his religious convictions, a deeply confused man. He had broken with Rome on the question of his marriage. He had presided over the dissolution of the monasteries and over other reforms that had moved the English Church in the direction of Protestantism. He had also, however, retained, throughout his life, a personal commitment to the traditional Catholic theology of the Mass, the sacraments, and the central doctrines of the medieval Church. The Church of England that he left behind at his death was, in its theology, an unstable compromise between the Protestant directions in which Cromwell and Cranmer had wanted to push it, and the Catholic positions to which Henry himself had remained personally attached. The religious settlements of the rest of the 16th century, under his 3 children Edward and Mary and Elizabeth, would attempt to resolve this instability, with each of them moving in a different direction, and with the eventual settlement under Elizabeth representing a kind of middle position that neither Henry nor any of his immediate successors had quite intended. The last days of his life, in January 1547, were the slow physical decline that his condition made inevitable. He had been ill with some complications of his chronic conditions throughout the autumn of 1546. By December, he was confined to his bed at Whitehall Palace. The physicians who attended him could do little except manage the symptoms. He received the last sacraments in the traditional Catholic rites that he had maintained throughout his life despite the break with Rome, in the small hours of the morning of the 28th of January 1547. He died shortly afterwards. He was 55 years old. He had reigned for 37 years, 7 months, and 17 days. He had married 6 times. He had produced 3 legitimate children, all of whom would eventually rule the country. He had transformed the religious and constitutional structure of the kingdom in ways that would shape the rest of English history. He had, in the end, lived the life that the accident of Arthur's death in 1502 had given him, and he had used that life, for better and for worse, to make himself one of the most consequential English monarchs of any period. The actual scene of his death is worth a more detailed picture because it captures, in its intimate detail, the particular human end to which a great reign came. The bedchamber at Whitehall, in the small hours of the morning of the 28th of January, was lit by candles. The fire was burning. The attendants who had been with him through the long final illness, including his physicians, his confessor, and the small group of gentlemen of the Privy Chamber whose duty it was to be present, were arranged around the room in the standard configuration the era required. Archbishop Cranmer, who had been summoned from Croydon when it was clear that the king was dying, had arrived at the palace some hours earlier and had been with the king through the final period. By this stage the king was unable to speak. Cranmer asked him for some sign that he died in the faith of Christ. By the accounts, Henry took Cranmer's hand and pressed it, a small gesture of acknowledgement that was all his condition now allowed. The pressing of that hand was, in a sense, the last action of the king's life, and it was the simple gesture that ended the long career of public action that the reign had been. Some minutes later, by the accounts, the king stopped breathing. The physicians who confirmed the death by the standard methods of the era made the formal announcement to the attendants in the room. The body was prepared for the subsequent ceremonies that the death of a king required. The reign that had transformed England came to its end in the private way that all reigns end. He was buried at Windsor, beside Jane Seymour, in the tomb that he had instructed to be prepared. The tomb itself was never properly completed. The elaborate monument that Henry had planned, with figures and inscriptions and ornaments, was never finished, and the simple tombstone that now marks the grave is the work of subsequent generations who have tried, with varying success, to provide an appropriate marker for the king who lies beneath. He shares the vault, by the accidents of subsequent royal burial decisions, with Charles I, the king who would be executed by Parliament 102 years after Henry's death, in the great civil disorder that the political settlement Henry had constructed could not, in the end, prevent. I want to spend the closing portion of the evening considering what we should make of all of this, because Henry VIII is in some ways the most controversial figure of English royal history, and the assessments of him have ranged from the celebratory to the savage, with most of the territory in between occupied by some intermediate positions. The case for Henry, when it has been made, has typically rested on the constitutional and political achievements of the reign. The break with Rome, whatever its origins in the matter of his marriage, did establish the principle of the sovereignty of the English crown over the English church, which would prove to be one of the foundations of the subsequent constitutional development of the country. The dissolution of the monasteries, whatever its cultural costs, did produce a substantial transfer of wealth to the secular elite of the country, which contributed to the political stability and economic development of the subsequent decades. The Reformation in England, however incomplete and inconsistent, did set in motion the process that would eventually produce the Protestant culture of the country, with all of the literary, scientific, and political consequences that this culture would bring. The naval expansion that Henry sponsored, which produced the modern English Navy, would prove to be the foundation of the maritime power that would shape the subsequent rise of Britain as a world empire. The reforms of the central administration that Cromwell, with Henry's authority, had introduced modernised the machinery of government in ways that the subsequent Tudor monarchs would build on, and that would in some respects anticipate the development of the modern state. The case against Henry, when it has been made, has typically rested on the human costs of the reign, the execution of two of his wives, the systematic destruction of the medieval religious culture of the country, the persecution of those who refused to accept the religious changes, the betrayals of his advisers and friends, the personal cruelty that became the increasingly dominant feature of his later years, are all features of the reign that any honest assessment has to acknowledge. He was by any measure a king under whose reign more people were executed for political reasons than under any previous English monarch, and the personal style of his later government was, in many respects, the kind of arbitrary cruelty that the English political tradition had historically associated with the worst kinds of tyranny. I think the honest assessment, taking the whole reign into account, is that Henry was a man of genuine talents who used those talents in service of a project that mixed the legitimate purposes of a great prince with the personal vanities and the eventual cruelties of a man whose character could not bear the moral weight of what he was doing. He was not, I think, a simple tyrant. The young Henry of 1509 was a genuinely impressive figure who, in different circumstances, might have made one of the great reigns of English history. He was also not, I think, a heroic reformer who reluctantly took on difficult tasks for the good of his country. The motives that drove the great changes of the reign were, in their first instance, the personal motives of a man who wanted a son, and who was prepared to do whatever was necessary to obtain one, and the ideological justifications that were assembled around these motives were, in many respects, the post hoc rationalizations of a king who had decided what he wanted and who was looking for ways to get it. What he became, in the second half of his reign, was something that I find difficult to characterize simply. He was not, by his own self-understanding, a tyrant. He continued throughout his reign to think of himself as a legitimate king acting within the proper limits of his royal authority, with the harsh actions of his government as the necessary responses to the genuine threats that the kingdom faced. He was, however, by any external assessment, a king whose understanding of the proper limits of royal authority had expanded, over the course of his reign, to include actions that the English political tradition had historically considered improper, and the willingness to take those actions when he considered them necessary was the developed pattern of his late government. The most generous interpretation of him, which has been offered by some sympathetic biographers over the centuries, is that he was a great prince who was destroyed by the medical conditions that beset him in middle age, and that the man who emerged from the 1536 accident was a different man from the king who had reigned with such confidence in the early years. The interpretation has some force, given what we now understand about the effects of chronic pain and possible head injury on personality, and it does account for some of the discontinuities in the documentary record between the Henry of the early years and the Henry of the late years. The least generous interpretation, which has been offered by some critical historians, is that the qualities that produced the cruelties of the late years were always there, even in the brilliant young king of the early years, and that the development of the reign produced the gradual revelation of these qualities rather than their creation. The interpretation has some force, given the early indications of arrogance, temper, and the willingness to use his power harshly that the documentary record preserves from the early years. The reasonable view, in my judgment, is that both interpretations contain some truth. The qualities that produced the late cruelties were, in their potential form, present in the early king. The medical conditions of the middle years removed the restraints, both physical and psychological, that had kept those qualities in check. The result was the king of the late years, who was both a continuation of the man of the early years and a substantially worse version of him. The wives taken together are the human cost of the reign that the popular memory has, with reasonable justice, focused on. Catherine of Aragon was treated with a sustained cruelty that her dignity, real as it was, did not deserve. Anne Boleyn was destroyed by a fabricated case in a manner that has rarely been equalled in English history. Jane Seymour died in childbirth, in the way that women in her position frequently died, and the question of how she would have fared if she had survived is one that the historical record does not allow us to answer. Anne of Cleves, by her own intelligence and her husband's reasonable response, escaped from the marriage with her life and her fortune intact, and she spent the rest of her days in considerable comfort. Catherine Howard was destroyed by her own indiscretions and by the political circumstances of her position, in a manner that, while not as fabricated as Anne Boleyn's case, was still, in any modern view, grotesquely disproportionate to her actual offences. Catherine Parr, by her intelligence and her care, survived the marriage and outlived the king, although her own subsequent life would be cut short by her death in childbirth in 1548, just over a year after Henry's own death. The 3 children, who were Henry's most consequential personal legacy, would each in turn rule the country. Edward VI, the son of Jane Seymour, came to the throne at 9 and ruled, through a series of regents, for 6 years before dying of tuberculosis at 15. Mary I, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, came to the throne at 37 and ruled for 5 years, during which she attempted to reverse the religious reforms of her father and her brother and to restore the Catholic Church in England, before dying of cancer in 1558. Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, came to the throne at 25 and ruled for 45 years, during which she presided over one of the most successful periods of English history. The 3 of them, between them, occupied the throne for 56 years, and the trajectory of their reigns, in its complex and often painful working out, was the principal political consequence of their father's choices in the matter of his marriages. I want to leave you, as a kind of closing thought, with a particular image that I think captures something about the man at the heart of this story. In 1547, in the days before Henry died, Catherine Parr and the small circle of attendants who were caring for him in his final illness gathered around his bed in the small hours of the morning. The king had been declining for some weeks, and the moment of his death was by this point expected within hours. The attendant priests prepared to administer the last rites in the traditional Catholic form that, despite all the religious changes of the previous 15 years, the king had insisted on for his own death. Henry, who was conscious but unable to speak, made small gestures of acknowledgement as the ceremonies were performed. He held, in his right hand, the hand of one of his attendants. He looked, with whatever his eyes could still focus on, at the people in the room. He was, in the testimony of those who were present, calm and apparently at peace, in a way that the difficulties of his final years had not entirely allowed him to be. The man in the bed, at this moment, was the same man who had been the brilliant young king of 1509. He was the same man who had married Catherine of Aragon at the chapel of the Franciscan friars at Greenwich. He was the same man who had pursued Anne Boleyn through 7 years of obsession. He was the same man who had presided over the dissolution of the monasteries and the destruction of the medieval religious culture of his country. He was the same man who had executed 2 of his wives and uncounted numbers of his subjects. He was, in this final moment, all of these men compressed into a single dying figure, and the moment of his death was the small, ordinary moment in which all of these selves came to their end together. He died, by the testimony of the attendants, peacefully. The complications of his condition had done their slow work, and the body that had been Henry VIII, simply, at a particular moment in the early morning of the 28th of January 1547, stopped functioning. The reign that had transformed England came to its end in the secluded way that all reigns end, with the death of a particular man in a particular bed in a particular palace, attended by the small circle of people who had been with him at the end. That is the moment I want you to hold on to as we approach the end of this evening's story. The man in the bed, not the famous king of the Holbein portraits, not the legendary tyrant of the popular imagination. The actual person, at the moment of his ending, who had lived the particular life that the accidents of his birth and his circumstances had given him, and who had used that life, for better and for worse, to make himself the figure that history has remembered. I want, before we finish, to say something about why this story matters, because the lives we have been considering on these evenings together are not just historical curiosities, but real human stories that, taken together, tell us something about what it is to be a person living through circumstances that are not entirely of our own choosing. Henry VIII was, in the first instance, a man whose entire adult life was shaped by an accident, the death of his older brother Arthur in 1502, that he had not planned for and that he could not have anticipated. The career he had been preparing for in the church was suddenly replaced, when he was 11, with a different career that he had not chosen. The qualities he had developed in preparation for his original life, the theological learning, the religious seriousness, the scholarly habits, were carried forward into the new life that the accident had given him, and they shaped the man he became in ways that the more conventional kingly preparation of his older brother might not have produced. He was, in the second instance, a man whose great personal project, the production of a male heir, became the organizing obsession of his middle years, and whose several actions in pursuit of this project transformed the country in ways that he had not, at the beginning of the project, particularly intended. The break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, the executions of the people who stood in his way, were not, in his original intention, the goals of his reign. They were the consequences of his pursuit of a goal that in itself was not unreasonable. He needed a male heir. The dynastic continuity of his family required one. The political stability of the country in the era of the Wars of the Roses depended on it. The pursuit of this goal was, in its origins, the legitimate concern of a responsible king. The transformations that the pursuit produced were, however, the consequences of how the pursuit unfolded in the particular circumstances of his time, and the cumulative result was something that nobody, including Henry himself, had quite intended. He was, in the third instance, a man whose character was tested, over the course of his reign, by the kinds of situations that test character, and whose character did not, in many cases, pass the tests. He was capable of generosity, of charm, of warmth, of genuine affection. He was also capable, when his interests required it, of betrayal, of cruelty, of the kinds of harsh and arbitrary actions that have rightly produced his unfavourable historical reputation. The mixture of these qualities in the proportions they finally took was the man he became, and the question of whether a different man, in his circumstances, would have produced different results is one of the unanswerable questions that the historical record allows us to ask, but not to answer. I want to come back, before we close, to several aspects of the reign that I have touched on only briefly, and that deserve a longer look, because the picture of the man and the era is not complete without them. The first is the daily life of the Tudor court, which was the immediate human environment within which Henry lived for nearly all of his adult life, and which shaped, in important ways, the kind of person he became. The Tudor court, in Henry's reign, was a movable establishment that travelled between several principal residences on a regular cycle. The king had, by the end of his reign, perhaps 50 palaces and houses scattered across the southern half of England, which he and his court occupied in turn through the year. The principal residences included Greenwich, where Henry himself had been born, and where the great state ceremonies of the early reign were often held; Hampton Court, which had originally been built by Cardinal Wolsey, and which Wolsey had given to the king in 1525 in a desperate attempt to recover royal favour, became, over the course of the reign, one of Henry's favourite palaces, and was substantially expanded by him. Whitehall, which had also been a Wolsey property, and which had also passed to the king after Wolsey's fall, became the principal palace of the late reign and was the building in which Henry actually died in 1547. Windsor Castle was used for the Garter ceremonies and for hunting in the great park that surrounded it. Richmond, Eltham, Nonsuch, Oatlands, and other houses provided the seasonal accommodation that the court's annual round required. The court itself, when it was in residence at one of these palaces, was a substantial human establishment of perhaps 1,000 people, including the king's personal household, the queen's household, the great officers of state, the attendants of the senior nobles who accompanied the king, and the corresponding service population of cooks and grooms and clerks and labourers. The cost of maintaining this establishment, by modern reckoning, would have been substantial, and the management of the court's finances, supplies and logistics was one of the major administrative undertakings of the kingdom. The kitchens of Hampton Court alone, which can still be visited today, were designed to produce on a normal day the food for perhaps 800 meals, and they constituted, in their physical extent and their organizational complexity, one of the great industrial operations of the era. The daily life of the king within this establishment followed a pattern that is reasonably well documented in the records of the Privy Chamber, which was the domestic establishment of attendants who served Henry in his most personal capacities. The king woke at perhaps 7 in the morning, in the great bedchamber that was the centre of his personal apartments. He was attended, on rising, by the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, who helped him out of his night-clothes, into his dressing gown, and through the small ceremonies of his morning toilet. He attended Mass, in the standard practice of the era, in the chapel that adjoined the royal apartments. He breakfasted, in the same private chamber, on whatever the kitchen had prepared. He met in the morning hours with the ministers and ambassadors and petitioners who had business with him. He read, in the small intervals between his engagements, the dispatches and the documents that the work of government produced. The midday meal, which was the principal meal of the day in the convention of the era, was a substantial event. It was served at perhaps 11 in the morning, in the great hall, or in the smaller dining chamber depending on the formality of the occasion. The king ate, in the standard practice, with a small group of senior attendants, and on certain occasions with the queen. The food, by all the accounts, was elaborate. The kitchen of the Tudor court produced, on a normal day, perhaps a dozen courses of kinds, with multiple dishes in each course, and the king selected from among these dishes whatever appealed to him in the moment. The wine that accompanied the meal was substantial. The atmosphere, in the formal dining occasions, was the kind of public theatrical event that the Tudor court understood as one of its most important social functions, with some visiting dignitaries observing the king's manner and reporting back to their courts on the impressions they had formed. After the midday meal, the king typically engaged in some form of physical activity or recreation. In the early years of the reign, this was the hunting on horseback, or the jousting, or the tennis, or the other athletic pursuits that the young Henry favoured. In the later years, when his physical condition had restricted these activities, it was the slower forms of recreation, including playing cards, reading, listening to music, or attending to the building projects that he supervised in his palaces. He was, throughout his life, a serious patron of music, and the court musicians who performed in the modest private chambers in the afternoons were, by the standards of the era, the leading practitioners of their art. The afternoon and evening were occupied by some political and social activities. The Privy Council, which was the senior advisory body of the kingdom, met regularly throughout the year, with the king attending as much or as little as his interest in the particular matters required. The foreign ambassadors who were resident at the court attended regular audiences. The English nobility and gentry who had business at court were received in the levels of formality that their rank and their business required. The evening meal, served at perhaps 6 in the afternoon by the standards of our day, or perhaps later as the era's dining habits gradually shifted later through the 16th century, was a less formal event than the midday meal, but still a substantial undertaking. After the meal, the king typically engaged in private entertainment with his closest attendants, including music, gambling, and the small social activities that the late evening allowed. He retired to bed at perhaps 10 or 11, attended by the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber in the reverse of the morning ceremonies. The whole pattern, taken as a daily round, gives us the image of a king whose life was in many ways lived in front of an audience. The privacy that we now consider essential to a normal life was not, for Henry, a routine experience. He was attended, at almost every waking moment, by some combination of his servants, his ministers, his attendants, and his courtiers. He slept in a bed that was attended through the night by gentlemen of the bedchamber who slept on pallets nearby. He used the chamber pot, when he needed it, in front of the attendants whose job it was to manage the small physical functions of his day. He was, in this respect, never quite alone, and the question of what kind of inner life he developed under these conditions is one that the documentary record cannot entirely answer, but that the small indications in the surviving sources suggest was more complex and more anxious than the public face of the reign would have suggested. The second aspect of the reign that I want to give a longer look to is the religious settlement that Henry left behind, because the question of what English religion actually became during his reign is more complex than the simple narrative of the break with Rome captures. The Church of England, by the time of Henry's death in 1547, was a peculiar kind of institution that did not fit neatly into either the Catholic or the Protestant categories that the Reformation had produced elsewhere in Europe. It had broken with the Pope. The king was the supreme head of the church. The monasteries had been dissolved. The English Bible, in the translation produced by the scholars under Cromwell's patronage, was now available in every parish church for the laity to read. The pilgrimages and shrines and devotional practices of medieval Catholicism had been suppressed. At the same time, however, the central theological doctrines of the Church remained essentially Catholic. The Mass continued to be celebrated, in Latin, with the traditional understanding of the real presence of Christ in the bread and wine. The clergy were celibate by law. The 7 sacraments of the medieval Church were retained. The traditional vestments, the traditional liturgical calendar, and the traditional hierarchy of bishops and priests were all maintained. The English Church under Henry was in many respects a Catholic church without the Pope, and the Protestant reforms that some of his ministers had wanted to introduce were, in the late years of the reign, actively resisted by the king himself. The instability of this position was the principal religious problem that Henry left to his successors. Edward VI's regents, who were Protestant in their sympathies, moved the church in a Protestant direction during the brief reign of the boy king, with the introduction of a vernacular liturgy in 1549, the abolition of clerical celibacy, the suppression of the Latin Mass, and the other reforms that the Protestant theologians of the era had been advocating. Mary, when she succeeded her brother in 1553, attempted to reverse all of these changes and to restore the Church to its Catholic position before the break with Rome, with the partial restoration of the monasteries, the reintroduction of clerical celibacy, the restoration of the Latin Mass, and the burnings of Protestant heretics that have given her the reputation she has carried in English memory ever since. Elizabeth, when she succeeded her sister in 1558, attempted a middle position, retaining the Protestant theology of the Church while preserving certain Catholic elements of its liturgy and structure, in the settlement that has come to be called the Elizabethan Compromise, and that has shaped the Church of England ever since. The settlement that emerged from these reversals and compromises was the strange hybrid that the Church of England has remained ever since, neither fully Protestant nor fully Catholic, retaining elements of both traditions in a peculiar combination that has given the Church its distinctive character. The whole arrangement was, in some real sense, the consequence of Henry's original instability on the religious question, and the Church that has endured for 5 centuries since his death is, in its peculiarities, the Church that he left behind, even though the specific form it took was the work of his successors rather than of him. The third aspect of the reign that I want to give a longer look to is the people other than the wives whose lives intersected with Henry's in significant ways, because the focus on the marriages tends to crowd out the other major figures of the reign, whose stories are, in their own ways, equally interesting. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, who was Henry's principal minister for the first half of the reign, was a man of remarkable origins who had risen, by his ability and his ambition, to become the most powerful churchman and the most powerful royal minister in early Tudor England. He was the son of an Ipswich butcher. He had been educated at Magdalen College, Oxford, and had entered the church as a young man with no particular family connections to support him. He had risen through a combination of administrative competence, intellectual ability, and a particular talent for managing the interests of the powerful men around him, to become the King's Almoner, then the Dean of York, then the Bishop of different sees in succession, then the Archbishop of York, and finally the Cardinal and Lord Chancellor of England, which were the positions he held at the height of his power in the 1520s. Wolsey, in his prime, was the effective ruler of England. He managed the foreign policy, he managed the domestic administration, he managed the church, he built, at his own expense or with funds whose provenance he handled with deliberate vagueness, the great palace at Hampton Court, which was, until he gave it to Henry in 1525, the most magnificent private residence in England. He lived in his establishments on a scale that approached the king's, with a personal household of perhaps 500 servants, and the kind of ceremonial state that the era expected of the great princes of the church. His fall, when it came in 1529, was the consequence of his failure to deliver the annulment of Henry's first marriage. The Pope's refusal to grant the annulment, which was not Wolsey's fault, but which Henry blamed him for nonetheless, was the political catastrophe that ended his career. He was stripped of his offices, sent into a kind of internal exile in the north of England and ordered to come to London to face charges of treason in the autumn of 1530. He died on the journey of natural causes at Leicester Abbey in November 1530. He was perhaps 57. His last words, as recorded by his attendant George Cavendish, who wrote a substantial biography of him after his death, included the famous reflection that if he had served God as diligently as he had served his king, God would not have given him over in his grey hairs. The reflection captures something essential about the position of any servant of the Tudor crown, which was the fundamental condition that the loyalty given was loyalty that could be withdrawn by the king at any moment, with consequences that the servant might not survive. Thomas More, who succeeded Wolsey as Lord Chancellor in 1529, was a different kind of figure, a man of considerable scholarly distinction and personal religious commitment, who had served Henry as a friend and counsellor since the earliest years of the reign. More was the author of Utopia, the great Latin work of political imagination that he had published in 1516, and that has remained in its translations, one of the most influential works of European political thought. He was a serious humanist scholar, a friend of Erasmus and of the other figures of the international Renaissance, and a man whose religious commitment to the traditional Catholic faith was the central feature of his identity. More accepted the Lord Chancellorship reluctantly in 1529 after Wolsey's fall. He served in the position for 3 years, during which he attempted to support the king's policies on matters where he could in good conscience do so while resisting the king's policies on the religious questions that were now at the centre of the political agenda. The position became increasingly untenable as the break with Rome developed. More resigned the chancellorship in 1532. He retired to his house in Chelsea, where he hoped to live out the rest of his life in quiet scholarly retirement. The retirement was not allowed. The king's government, which required visible support from the senior figures of the kingdom, demanded that More take the oaths that the new political and religious settlement required. More refused to take the oath of supremacy, which acknowledged the king as supreme head of the church. He was arrested, imprisoned in the Tower, and tried for treason on the basis of evidence that included perjured testimony from one of the king's advisers. He was condemned and executed on the 6th of July 1535. He was 57. His last words, on the scaffold, included the famous declaration that he died the king's good servant, but God's first. He was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower, although his head was placed on London Bridge for the ceremonial public display that the era considered appropriate for traitors. More's execution was, in some respects, the most disturbing single political act of the reign before the executions of the wives. He had been Henry's friend for 25 years. He was, by every contemporary account, including Henry's own, a man of exceptional integrity and exceptional ability. He had served the king with consistent loyalty, except in the one matter on which his own conscience prevented him from going along with the new policy. The willingness of Henry to put him to death for this single point of conscience was a turning point in the development of the king's character and in the political atmosphere of the kingdom. After More, no one was safe. The willingness to execute even the most distinguished and most personally close of the king's servants for the failure to comply with the political requirements of the moment was the new principle of the late government, and the subsequent executions of the reign were the consequences of this principle. Thomas Cranmer, who became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1533, and who was the principal religious architect of the Reformation in England, was a different kind of figure from More. a more cautious and more politically pliable man whose theological views moved gradually in the Protestant direction over the course of his career. Cranmer's principal achievement, beyond the practical reforms that he supervised under Henry, was the production of the Book of Common Prayer in 1549, after Henry's death, which became the standard liturgical book of the Church of England, and which remains, in its subsequent revisions, one of the great prose works of the English language. Cranmer would, in his turn, be executed in 1556, under Mary, after recanting his reformist views under pressure, and then publicly recanting his recantation at his execution in one of the great moments of Reformation drama. The other figures of the reign, the great nobles and ministers and ambassadors and bishops, would each in their own way be shaped by the king they served. Some of them would die in their beds in old age, as Cromwell did not, but as some of his successors did. Some of them would die on the scaffold. Some of them would be exiled or imprisoned and emerge, in the reversals of the subsequent decades, into renewed political prominence. The cumulative human cost of the reign, on the people who served at its centre, was substantial, and the Tudor court of Henry's later years was a place where the rewards of high office were paid for, in many cases, with the kinds of personal risks that the modern reader can find difficult to imagine. The fourth aspect of the reign that I want to mention is the question of the historical sources themselves, because the way we know what we know about Henry VIII is itself one of the interesting features of the era. The reign of Henry VIII is one of the best documented periods of English medieval and early modern history. The state archives, which were systematically maintained under Cromwell's reorganisation of the central administration, preserve thousands of documents from the period, including the correspondence between the king and his ministers, the diplomatic dispatches of the foreign ambassadors at the English court, the financial and legal records of the government, and the private papers of many of the leading figures. The Public Record Office, which is now part of the National Archives at Kew, holds the bulk of these state documents, and the private archives held by the great families and by the universities and by the British Library hold many of the supplementary documents. The interpretive literature on the reign, which has been produced over the past 400 years, is enormous. The first major biography of Henry, by the scholar George Cavendish, who had been Wolsey's attendant and who wrote his life of his master in the 1550s, established the basic outlines of the early reign. Subsequent biographies, by some Protestant and Catholic writers of the 17th and 18th centuries, refined the picture in directions according to the religious and political interests of the writers. The great Victorian historians, including James Anthony Froude, who wrote a substantial 12-volume history of the period in the 1860s, established the basic narrative that subsequent scholarship has refined. The 20th century historians, including A.G. Dickens and Geoffrey Elton, brought new analytical tools and new archival research to the reign, and produced the more sophisticated understanding that we now have. The recent generation of historians, including David Starkey, Diarmaid McCulloch, Eric Ives, John Guy, and others, have continued the process of refining and reinterpreting the reign, and the cumulative scholarly literature on Henry VIII is now one of the largest and most sophisticated bodies of historical writing on any single English monarch. The popular literature on the reign, in the biographies, novels, films, and television series of the past several centuries, has been almost equally extensive. The popular imagination of Henry VIII that the modern reader inherits is the product of a long process of dramatic interpretation and reinterpretation, in which some aspects of the reign have been emphasized or downplayed according to the interests of the moment. The Henry of the popular memory is, in many respects, the Henry of these dramatizations, and the relationship between this popular figure and the historical figure that the documentary record preserves is one of the interesting questions that any modern engagement with the reign has to address. I want to give one more substantial section to the question of what daily life at the stages of Henry's reign would actually have looked like, because the abstract patterns I have been describing are easier to absorb when they are anchored in the specific texture of a particular day. Imagine yourself for a moment in the great hall of Hampton Court Palace on a winter afternoon in December 1532. The court is in residence at Hampton for the Christmas season. The hall, which is a substantial chamber perhaps 100 feet long and 40 wide, with a great hammer-beam roof of carved oak that rises perhaps 60 feet above the floor, is decorated for the Christmas observances. The walls are hung with the great tapestries that the king has imported from Brussels, which depict the scenes from classical mythology and biblical history that the Renaissance taste favoured. The ceiling is decorated with painted stars and roses on a blue background. The great fireplaces at either end of the hall are burning with substantial fires. The tables, which are arranged in the standard formation with the high table at one end on a raised dais, and the long lower tables running down the length of the hall, are laid for the great Christmas feast that will be served in the evening. The king, at this moment, is in his privy chamber elsewhere in the palace, attending to the afternoon engagements that his routine requires. He has been hunting in the great park during the morning, with the hunt finishing at perhaps noon. He has bathed in one of the small bathing rooms that the palace contains. He has eaten his midday meal in his private dining chamber. He is now meeting with Thomas Cromwell and with 2 of the bishops to discuss the matters of state that the religious crisis is producing. Anne Boleyn, by this point, is the king's acknowledged future wife, although she is not yet his actual wife. The marriage will take place in secret in January, perhaps 6 weeks from this moment. She is in her own apartments in another part of the palace, attended by her ladies-in-waiting, working on the preparations for the Christmas entertainments that she will preside over in the absence of Catherine, who has been removed from the court, and who is now at the manor of the Moor in Hertfordshire. Catherine herself at this same moment is at the Moor, with her own substantially reduced household, conducting the small religious observances of the Christmas season that her position now allows. She is 46. She has been Henry's wife for 23 years, although the marriage will be formally annulled in 5 months. She is at this moment working on her embroidery, which has become one of her principal occupations in the long-enforced idleness of her current situation. She is reading the prayer book that her mother gave her at her departure from Spain 40 years earlier. She is writing, in the careful Latin of her education, a letter to her nephew the Emperor, in which she describes her current circumstances and asks for his continued advocacy on her behalf. The young Princess Mary, at this moment, is 16. She is at the small court that has been maintained for her at Beaulieu in Essex. She has not seen her mother in more than a year. She has not seen her father in nearly 6 months. She is, at this moment, at her lessons with her tutors, working on the Latin translation that her education requires. She is, by all the contemporary accounts, an intellectually serious young woman who is suffering with the kind of dignified endurance that her mother has taught her, the difficulties that her situation has produced. The next several years will be the worst years of her life, as the political and personal pressures on her intensify and as her mother's situation deteriorates further. She will, at one point in the late 1530s, sign the document acknowledging her own illegitimacy under the kind of duress that the era's political pressures could produce. She will in due course find her way back into the political settlement of her father's reign, and will eventually, 2 decades from this moment in 1532, become queen herself. But at this moment in December 1532, she is a young woman in a difficult position, with limited prospects and substantial daily anxieties, who is doing what young women in her position have always done, which is to continue with her duties and to wait for the eventual resolution of her situation. The other figures of the court, in this same moment in December 1532, are conducting their own daily lives in the directions that the household requires. The kitchens are at full activity, with perhaps 50 cooks and kitchen staff working on the preparation of the great evening meal. The stables are being prepared for the entertainments of the next day, when the king will hunt again. The musicians of the Chapel Royal are rehearsing the music for the religious services of the season. The ambassadors of Spain and France and the Empire are writing their reports of the day's developments in the careful diplomatic prose that the era required. The petitioners and merchants and minor nobles who have come to court for their business are waiting in the antechambers and the public spaces for the audiences that the king's officers will eventually grant them. The whole apparatus is the human establishment that supports the king's daily life, in the form that this life has taken in the particular circumstances of December 1532. The arrangements are complex, expensive, and demanding of the time and energy of perhaps 1,000 people. The arrangements are also, in their cumulative effect, the daily reality of the reign, and the small individual lives that compose them are the lives that, taken together, constitute what it actually meant to live at the Tudor court at this particular moment in history. The smells of the palace, in this winter afternoon, would have been the particular combination that the era's domestic life produced. The smoke of the fires, the aromatic herbs strewn on the floors of the great public rooms to mask the unavoidable odours of human and animal occupation, the cooking smells from the kitchens, the specific smell of beeswax candles in the chambers of the senior figures and tallow candles in the chambers of the lesser servants, the smell of the rushes that covered the floors of the lesser rooms, the smell of the perfumes and pomades that the courtiers used to mask their own odours in an era when bathing was infrequent. The sounds, similarly, would have been the particular combination of the era. The constant low murmur of voices in the chambers and corridors, the footsteps of the attendants and servants moving through the palace on their errands, the distant music of the court musicians rehearsing in some chamber elsewhere, the barking of the dogs that the king kept in the establishments, the bells of the chapel marking the hours, the cumulative texture of the place in its sights and sounds and smells was the daily atmosphere that the people of the court inhabited, and the recovery of this atmosphere by the modern imagination is one of the small things that a careful engagement with the era can give us. I have given you this scene because I think the abstract narrative of the reign tends to collapse the particular moments into the general patterns, and because the actual experience of living through these years for the people who lived through them was the experience of particular moments rather than of the general patterns that historians have subsequently constructed. The people in the Great Hall at Hampton Court in December 1532 did not know, in any precise sense, what was going to happen next. They knew the general shape of the political situation. They could anticipate, with reasonable accuracy, the broad outlines of the next few months. They could not, however, see the future with the clarity that we, looking back, can see it. They were, in this respect, in the same position that we ourselves are in our own moment, with the uncertainties of our own future. The clarity with which we can see the past is the clarity that hindsight provides. and the lives of the people who actually lived through the events were lived in their own moment, with the same uncertainty and the same partial visibility that our own lives are lived with. I find this in itself one of the small important corrections that the careful study of history can offer. The figures of the past, who can seem, in the simplified narratives that come down to us, to have been moving toward their fates with a kind of inevitability, were in fact people who were navigating their own present without the advantage of knowing how it would turn out. The Henry VIII of December 1532, who was about to embark on the secret marriage that would set in motion the political and religious revolution of the next several years, did not know with any precision how that revolution would unfold. He thought, as people about to make major decisions usually think, that he had a reasonable plan and that the plan would produce the result he wanted. The plan, as plans often do, produced results that the original planner had not entirely anticipated, and the man at the center of the plan had to navigate, in real time, the complications that the unfolding events produced. This is, I think, one of the lessons that the careful study of any historical figure can offer. The figures of the past were not the simplified characters that the dramatic narratives have made them. They were, in their own moments, complicated human beings who were navigating their own difficulties with the same kind of partial information and the same kind of uncertain judgment that any of us bring to our own difficulties. The Henry VIII that the popular memory has constructed, the bluff, hearty tyrant of the legend, is in many respects a kind of caricature that flattens out the complexity of the actual man. The actual Henry, as the documentary record allows us to know him, was a person of considerable ability and considerable difficulty, who lived a particular life that was, in its specific course, the result of the specific choices he made in the specific circumstances he encountered. I want to spend a few moments, before we close, on the question of what visitors today can actually see of the Henry VIII world, because the surviving physical traces of the reign are more substantial than the modern visitor might assume, and a properly informed visit to the surviving sites can give the imagination something concrete to work with. Hampton Court Palace, which is now a historic royal palace open to visitors, preserves more of the Henrician original than any other surviving building. The Great Hall, which I described in my imagined scene, still stands, with its hammer-beam roof and its wall of stained glass containing the king's some heraldic emblems. The kitchens, which produced the food for the court, have been substantially restored and can be walked through. The Chapel Royal, where Catherine Howard was arrested in 1541 in the moment that began her destruction, retains its Tudor ceiling and the royal pew where the king and queen attended services. The Great Watching Chamber, which was the room where the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber waited for the king's summons, still stands with its tapestries and its ornaments. The courts and corridors of the original Tudor palace, which were significantly extended by Christopher Wren under William and Mary in the 17th century, can be distinguished from the later additions by the careful eye, and the visitor who knows what to look for can walk, in essence, the same paths that Henry himself walked in his daily routines. The Tower of London, which was the principal royal prison, and which was the site of the executions of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, among many others, preserves the Tudor structures that the era used for its prisoners. The Bloody Tower, where Anne is supposed to have been held, can be visited, although the certainty of which particular cell she occupied is uncertain. The Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she and Catherine Howard were buried, is open to visitors at certain hours, and the memorial plaques and the small altar that mark the site of the burials can be seen. The site of the scaffold on Tower Green, where the executions took place, is marked with a small memorial that commemorates the people who died there. Westminster Abbey, where Henry and Catherine of Aragon were crowned in 1509, preserves the high altar and the ceremonial spaces of the original ceremony, although the choir and the other parts of the abbey have been substantially altered by the subsequent centuries of additions and renovations. The tombs of Henry's parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, in the Henry VII Chapel, are among the great surviving Tudor monuments, with their elaborate Italianate sculpture and their substantial scale. Henry's own tomb, however, is not at Westminster, but at Windsor, where he is buried with Jane Seymour in the vault below St. George's Chapel. The other Tudor buildings that have survived, in greater or lesser degrees of completeness, can be visited at locations across England. The remains of Greenwich Palace, where Henry himself was born and where the early ceremonies of the reign took place, are now substantially gone, with the site occupied by the Royal Naval College and the subsequent buildings that the post-Tudor centuries have produced, although the small Tudor crypt of the original chapel can still be visited under one of the modern buildings. The Queen's House at Greenwich, which was built by Inigo Jones for Anne of Denmark in the early 17th century, occupies part of the site of the original palace and gives the modern visitor some sense of where the original Tudor building stood. The Tudor buildings of Eltham Palace in southeast London, which was one of Henry's principal childhood residences, preserve the great hall of the medieval palace with its hammer-beam roof and its features, although the rest of the palace was rebuilt in the 1930s by the Courtauld family in an Art Deco style that gives the visitor an unusual but interesting combination of medieval and modern architecture. The Mary Rose, which was Henry's flagship, and which sank in the Solent in 1545 in the engagement with the French fleet, was raised from the seabed in 1982 and is now displayed in a substantial museum at Portsmouth. The ship, which is one of the great archaeological recoveries of the 20th century, gives the modern visitor a direct connection to the actual physical world of Henry's reign, with the timbers and the equipment and the personal possessions of the men who served on her preserved in remarkable detail. The bones of the men who died with her, several hundred of them, have been studied with modern forensic techniques, and the resulting research has produced one of the most detailed pictures we have of the lives of ordinary Tudor men, including their diet, their occupational injuries, their childhood diseases, and the features of their physical existence that the documentary record does not capture. The surviving portraits of Henry and the figures of his court, which are held in the National Portrait Gallery and in some private collections, give us the visual record of the people themselves. The Holbein portraits, in particular, are the principal source for our visual sense of the era, and the originals, when they can be seen in the museums where they are held, are works of considerable power. The Holbein portrait of Henry at Whitehall, which is the basis for the standard image of the king that the popular memory has retained, was actually destroyed in the fire of 1698, but copies of it survive in museums, and the original cartoon which Holbein used to lay out the painting is held at the National Portrait Gallery and can be examined by visitors. The portraits of the queens, including the Holbein miniature of Anne Boleyn that is held at the National Portrait Gallery, and the portraits of Catherine of Aragon and Jane Seymour and Anne of Cleves and Catherine Parr that are held in several collections, give us the visual record of the women who married the king and the ways they presented themselves to the world. The cumulative effect of a properly informed visit to the surviving sites and the surviving objects is, I think, considerable. The modern visitor who walks through the Great Hall at Hampton Court, who stands on the spot of the scaffold at Tower Green, who looks at the Holbein cartoon at the National Portrait Gallery, who descends into the wreck of the Mary Rose at Portsmouth, can construct, from these physical traces, a picture of the era that the abstract narrative cannot quite supply. The era was in its time the daily reality of particular human beings who lived in particular places and who used particular objects and who attended particular ceremonies. The fact that we can still, in the 21st century, see some of those places and touch some of those objects and stand in some of those rooms is one of the small, genuine privileges that the survival of historical material allows us. I want to close now with a small reflection on what the whole story we have been considering tonight is, in the end, about. The story of Henry VIII is, in the most obvious sense, the story of a particular king and a particular reign and a particular set of historical events. It is also, however, a story about something more general, which is the question of what happens when a person of considerable ability is given more power than any human being can really handle responsibly, and is then placed under the kinds of pressures that test character to its limits. Henry was, in the early years of his reign, a young man whose abilities seemed to promise one of the great reigns of English history. He had the education, the physical presence, the personal charm, and the political opportunity that the situation required. He inherited a kingdom that was, by the standards of the era, in reasonable condition, with adequate finances, no major foreign wars, and a settled domestic order. He had, at his disposal, the kind of advisers and ministers that any king could have hoped for. He had, in his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a queen of considerable accomplishment who could have been the partner of a successful long reign. The conditions for greatness, in any reasonable assessment of his early circumstances, were as favourable as any English king had ever inherited. What he did with these conditions over the course of his reign was to produce a mixed result that included considerable genuine achievement and considerable genuine cruelty. The achievements, in their best light, included the establishment of the principle of national sovereignty over the Church, the reform of the central administration of the kingdom, the building of the modern English navy, and the production of 3 competent monarchs to succeed him. The cruelties, in their worst light, included the destruction of 2 of his wives, the systematic dismantling of the medieval religious culture of his country, the executions of many of his most loyal servants, and the development of a style of personal government that the English political tradition has rightly considered tyrannical. The mixture of these elements in the proportions they finally took is the mixture that the historical record has preserved, and the question of how to weigh them against each other is one that each reader of the period has to answer for themselves. There is no single correct verdict on Henry VIII, and the writers who have attempted to render one have in most cases produced verdicts that say more about themselves than about him. The reasonable position, I think, is to hold both elements in mind simultaneously, to acknowledge the genuine achievements without minimizing the genuine cruelties, and to remember that the man who produced both was a single person whose qualities combined in the particular life he lived to produce the particular outcome that the historical record has handed down to us. I want to give you, as the final thought of the evening, a particular moment that I think captures something essential about the man we have been considering. In 1538, 2 years after Anne Boleyn's death and 1 year after Jane Seymour's death, Henry was, by all the contemporary accounts, in a state of considerable personal isolation. He had killed 2 of his wives and lost a third. He had, in his pursuit of a male heir, transformed the religious and political structure of his kingdom in ways that he had not entirely anticipated. He had, by this point in his life, accumulated the kinds of personal losses that produce, in any reflective person, the kind of internal questioning that the day-to-day demands of a king's life rarely permit, The contemporary accounts give us for this period the small moments of personal vulnerability that the king sometimes allowed himself to show in front of the small circle of his closest attendants. He spoke, on certain occasions, about the losses he had experienced. He spoke about his missing of Jane in particular, whose death had affected him in a way that the other losses had not quite done. He spoke about his concerns for his son, who was then a year old, and whose health was the kind of constant worry that the king's experience with his other children had taught him not to take for granted. He spoke about his concerns for the kingdom, which was facing the kinds of internal religious tensions that the recent reforms had produced, and that the suppression of the pilgrimage of grace had not entirely resolved. These small moments of personal reflection, which are recorded in the dispatches of the ambassadors who heard about them, and in the private correspondence of the court figures who witnessed them, give us the picture of a man who, at this point in his life, was in some real sense carrying a substantial weight of personal experience. He was 47. He had been king for 29 years. He had, in those 29 years, experienced more political and personal upheaval than any English king of the earlier centuries. He was, in the private moments when he allowed himself to reflect on his life, the kind of man whom the modern reader can almost recognize with the complications and contradictions that any long human life produces. He was in this period also the man who would in the next decade marry 3 more wives, execute one of them, and continue the political and religious projects that had defined his reign. The reflective Henry of 1538 was the same Henry who would do all these later things, and the question of how those aspects of his character coexisted in one person is one the historical record allows us to ask, but not fully answer. I want you to imagine him then, in this secluded moment in 1538, in his apartments at one of his palaces, perhaps Whitehall, Hampton Court, or Greenwich. He is sitting in a chair by the fire in the evening, after the engagements of the day have ended. The gentlemen of the Privy Chamber are at their stations elsewhere in the apartments. The other people who normally surround him are in different rooms for the moment. He is, briefly, alone with his thoughts. The fire is burning, the candles are lit, the room is warm and quiet, and contains, for this small moment, only him. He is thinking of Catherine, who has been dead for 2 years and whom he had loved, in his early years, in a way that the later events of his life had not entirely erased from memory. He is also thinking of Anne, whose execution at his command had produced in him the kind of complicated feeling a modern psychologist would recognize as guilt or regret, though his error did not give him language to express it directly. Then of Jane, whose loss is still recent and still painful, of his son, sleeping in the nursery elsewhere in the palace, attended by the small establishment of nurses and attendants responsible for his care, of his 2 daughters, both of whom he has, in his political decisions, declared illegitimate, and both of whom he has, in other decisions, allowed to grow up at his court in conditions of variable comfort, and of the men who have served him over the years, some now dead at his command, some still serving him, and some he is in the process of distrusting in ways that will produce further executions in the coming years. He is thinking in this domestic moment about the life he has lived. It is the particular life that the accidents of his birth and his circumstances have given him. It includes the achievements he is proud of and the actions he is, in small private moments, less proud of. It is at this point in 1538, in a real sense, the life of a particular person sitting by the fire in the evening, considering what he has done and what he has yet to do. That is the man I want you to hold in your mind as we end this evening. Not the famous king of the portraits and the legends, the actual person in a small private moment of the evening, considering his own life. He was a king. He did what kings of his era did, in the way his own character produced. He was also a person who lived the life that was given to him. The other people of his era, who lived their own lives, did likewise in their own ways, in the positions the age had assigned to them. The historical record preserves what it preserves of all of them. Popular memory has produced the simplified versions of them that we now inherit. The actual people, however, were the ones who lived those lives, and the small recognition of that simple fact is, in the end, what the careful study of any historical figure can give us. Henry VIII lived. He died. He left behind the consequences of his life that the subsequent centuries have processed in their ways. The story of his reign is, in this respect, one of the great human stories that English history has produced, and the dramatizations and biographies and analyses built on it are subsequent attempts to understand what the actual events meant. What they meant in the end depends on how you read them. The readings that have been offered have ranged from the celebratory to the savage, with most of the territory in between occupied by intermediate positions. The reading I have given you tonight is, I hope, somewhere in the more reasonable middle range, with both the achievements and the cruelties given their proper weight, and with the central man kept in his place as a complicated human being rather than as either a hero or a villain. He was in the end just a man, a particularly powerful man, a particularly consequential man, a particularly difficult man in his late years, a man whose long life produced the outcome that the historical record has preserved, the kind of person, in his essential nature, that any of us are, with familiar limitations and capacities, and with small private moments by the fire in the evening, considering his own life. That is, I think, the truth at the center of this story. The famous figures of history were, in their own moments, just people. They lived their own lives with ordinary daily textures that any of us live with. The fact that they happened to be in positions of considerable power and consequence does not change this fundamental fact about them. They were people. They lived. They died. The world continued. The consequences of their lives worked themselves out in the subsequent decades and centuries. This, I think, is what historical study, when it is done well, gives us. Not the dramatic simplifications, not the moral judgments that are too easy to make. The recognition that the people of the past were just people, in the ordinary human sense that we ourselves are people, who lived their lives in the circumstances that the world had given them, and who did the best they could, or sometimes much worse than the best they could, with the materials they had been given. Henry VIII, by the standards of any reasonable assessment, did considerably worse than the best he could. He had been given in his early life advantages that few people of any era have ever been given. He used those advantages over the course of his reign in ways that produced both genuine achievement and genuine cruelty. The mixture of these results is the mixture that the historical record has preserved. The man who produced that mixture was the human being whom the accidents of his life had shaped, and the recognition of his humanity, with all its complications, is, in the end, the most that the careful study of his life can offer us. He is in this sense one of the figures of history through whom we can practice the kind of careful, patient seeing that the figures of history deserve. The careful patient seeing that we ourselves in our own moments would also wish to receive from any future observer who might come to consider our own particular lives. The seeing that recognizes the complications, that holds the contradictions in mind together, that does not collapse the actual person into the simplified version that is easier to handle. The Henry VIII that the careful patient seeing can produce is the most that the documentary record allows us to know, and it is, in the end, considerably more interesting than the simpler versions that the popular memory has constructed. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one.